She didn't ask for money. She didn't ask for food. She walked through a crowd of 200 bikers, men with scarred knuckles and prison ink and engine grease under their fingernails. And she chose him. An 8-year-old girl with dirt on her knees and fear older than her years pressed a folded piece of notebook paper into a stranger's hand. A hand-drawn map, crude lines, stick houses, and at the end of one street, a red X so heavy the crayon had torn through the paper. On the back, 5 words written in a child's shaking hand. Please come before tonight. Before he could speak, she was gone, and everything he'd spent 6 years running from caught up to him in a single heartbeat. If you want to find out what that red X really meant, and what happened when those engines fired up, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from, and let's ride. The charity rally had been Rhett Mercer's idea of hiding in plain sight. 300 motorcycles parked in a sun-scorched fairground lot outside Carlo, a dying industrial town 40 miles south of nowhere in central Illinois. Vendors selling bratwurst and cheap beer. A local country band murdering Johnny Cash covers through blown speakers. Children chasing each other between rows of chrome and leather while their parents pretended life was still good in a town where the last factory had closed 18 months ago. Rhett leaned against the fender of his matte black Road King, arms crossed, watching the crowd without being part of it. 41 years old, 6'2", a face that looked like it had been carved from oak and then left out in bad weather. 3 tours in Afghanistan had given him a limp he refused to acknowledge, a scar that ran from his left ear to his collarbone, and a particular kind of silence that made people cross the street. He wore the cut of the Iron Sentinels MC, a club that operated out of a converted machine shop on the east side of Carlo. Not a one-percenter outfit, not a weekend warrior club. Something in between. Something harder to explain. Men who had come back from wars with no parades, no jobs, and no tolerance for the world that had sent them. The patch on Rhett's back showed a shield split by a single bolt of lightning. Underneath it read, "Stand or fall." He hadn't wanted to come today. Crowds made his jaw tight. The smell of grilled meat mixed with gasoline reminded him of a forward operating base he'd rather forget. But Deacon Wolf, the club's president, had made it clear. Show face, shake hands, smile if you can remember how. The rally raised money for veterans' families, and the Sentinels needed the town to see them as something other than the rough men who rode too loud past the courthouse on Sunday mornings. So Rhett stood there, watching, not smiling. That was when he saw her. She moved through this crowd the way water moves through rock, finding every gap, slipping between legs and elbows, never bumping anyone, never making a sound. A small girl, maybe 8, wearing a yellow sundress 2 sizes too big that had been washed so many times the color had faded to the shade of old paper. Brown hair pulled back in a ponytail that was coming undone. Sneakers with no socks, knees dirty, eyes enormous. She wasn't looking at the bikes. She wasn't looking at the food. She was scanning faces with a focus that didn't belong to a child. Searching, eliminating, moving on. Rhett watched her pass 3 clusters of bikers without slowing down. She glanced at each man, measured something invisible, and kept walking. A woman near the lemonade stand tried to stop her. "Honey, are you lost?" And the girl shook her head without breaking stride. Then she looked at Rhett and stopped. Something passed between them that he couldn't name. Not recognition, not trust. Something more primitive. The way a wounded animal looks at the one person in a room who won't flinch. She crossed the last 15 feet of gravel with her chin down and her shoulders pulled in, as if she expected to be told to leave. In her right hand, she clutched a folded piece of notebook paper so tightly her knuckles were white. She stopped 2 feet in front of him, looked up. Her eyes were the color of creek water, brown with flecks of green, and they held something no child's eyes should hold. She didn't speak. She just extended her hand and pressed the paper against his palm. Rhett took it by reflex. The paper was warm and damp from her grip. He started to unfold it. When he looked up to ask her name, she was already gone, swallowed by the crowd as if she'd never existed. He unfolded the paper. A map, hand-drawn in crayon and pencil. Streets rendered as wobbly lines. Houses as small squares. A main road labeled in careful block letters, Mill Street, with an arrow pointing east, side streets branching off, and at the end of the last street, drawn so hard the red crayon had torn through the paper, a large X. Rhett turned it over. 5 words. Written in pencil. The letters uneven, some of them backward. The handwriting of a child who was trying very hard not to shake. Please come before tonight. His chest went cold. Not the cold of fear, the cold of recognition. He'd seen that handwriting before, taught not these specific words, but that particular desperate neatness. The care of someone who knows they only get one chance to be understood. He'd seen it in letters from his younger sister, 15 years ago. Letters he'd received too late. Rhett folded the map and put it in his vest pocket. He walked through the crowd looking for the girl. 5 minutes, 10. She was gone. He asked 2 vendors, a woman selling raffle tickets, a deputy sheriff leaning against his cruiser drinking lemonade. Nobody had noticed her. Nobody remembered a girl in a faded yellow dress. Nobody paid attention to the quiet ones. He found Deacon near the main stage, talking to a city councilman with a handshake that looked like it was being held hostage. Deacon Wolf was 53, built like a refrigerator someone had wrapped in denim, with a salt and pepper beard that reached his chest and eyes that missed nothing. He'd done 8 years in the Army, 2 combat deployments, and 17 months in a federal facility for something he never discussed. He ran the Iron Sentinels the way a good sergeant runs a platoon, with absolute authority and absolute loyalty. Rhett pulled him aside without apology, handed him the map. Deacon studied it, turned it over, read the 5 words. His expression didn't change, but his jaw tightened in a way Rhett had learned to read over 6 years of riding together. Mill Street, Deacon said. That's Southgate. I know what it is. Southgate was the neighborhood the town had been trying to forget for a decade. Old worker housing from the factory era. Narrow lots, clapboard siding, porches that sagged like tired shoulders. The city had rezoned the entire area for commercial redevelopment 18 months ago. Since then, the families who still lived there had been squeezed. Property taxes tripled overnight, code enforcement showing up weekly with new violations, water pressure problems that never got fixed. The message was clear: leave or be buried in fines until you can't afford to stay. A kid drew this, Deacon said. She walked through 300 bikers and handed it to me. Why you? Rhett didn't answer. He didn't know. Or maybe he did, and the answer was something he wasn't ready to say out loud. Deacon looked at the map again, traced the red X with his thumb. Before tonight, he read. That's not a kid asking for a birthday party. No. You want to ride? Yeah. Deacon folded the map and handed it back. He looked out over the crowd. The music, the laughter, the illusion of a town that still worked. Then he whistled. Sharp. 2 fingers. The sound cut through the noise like a blade. Within 90 seconds, 6 men stood around them. Colt Raines, the club's sergeant-at-arms. A wiry redhead with a prosthetic left hand he'd earned in Fallujah and a temper he kept on a very short leash. Maceo Torres, the club's road captain, who spoke 4 languages and trusted none of them. Burke, whose last name nobody used because nobody knew it. A quiet giant who could rebuild a transmission blindfolded. Harlan Voss, the youngest patch holder, 26, with the nervous energy of a man who'd spent 3 years in county and still checked every door twice. And 2 others, Pike and Dunaway, who asked no questions and needed none. Deacon explained, kept it short. Map, kid, red X. Before tonight. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Colt adjusted the glove on his prosthetic hand and said, So we're going. It wasn't a question. 7 engines fired in sequence. The sound rolled across the fairground like distant thunder, and a few heads turned, but most people had already gone back to their beer and their bratwurst. 7 motorcycles pulled out of the lot in a staggered formation, Rhett at the front with the map open against his tank, and headed east on Route 9 toward the part of town that the rest of Carlo had already decided didn't exist. The ride took 11 minutes. The landscape changed in the first 3. Storefronts gave way to empty lots. Empty lots gave way to boarded windows. The road surface deteriorated. Potholes deep enough to swallow a wheel. No streetlights. No sidewalks. Just cracked asphalt and weeds pushing through concrete and the particular silence of a place that has been abandoned by every system designed to protect it. Mill Street was worse than Rhett remembered. He'd ridden through Southgate twice in the past year and hadn't slowed down either time. Now he saw it. Really saw it. Houses with plywood over broken windows, yards that hadn't been mowed in months, a fire hydrant leaking a steady stream of brown water into the gutter. On one porch, an elderly man sat in a lawn chair with a shotgun across his knees, watching them approach with eyes that expected nothing good. Rhett followed the map, left on Archer. Right on a street so narrow the bikes had to ride single file, past a house with a condemned notice stapled to the door, past another with a child's bicycle chained to the railing, the front wheel missing. The red X corresponded to the last house on the block. A small two-story with peeling white paint and a front porch that listed to the right. A garden hose coiled in the yard like a dead snake. Curtains drawn on every window. And on the front steps, sitting with her arms around her knees, was the girl in the faded yellow dress, Sadie Quinn. She didn't flinch when 7 motorcycles rumbled to a stop in front of her house. She didn't run inside. She didn't call for her mother. She just looked at Rhett with those creekwater eyes and nodded once, as if confirming something she'd already decided. Rhett killed his engine. The silence that followed was enormous. "You came," she said. "You asked." She stood up, brushed off her dress, glanced at the 6 men behind Rhett with a look that was neither afraid nor impressed, just calculating the way a child calculates when trust is a currency she can't afford to waste. "My mom's inside," she said. "She can't walk good right now." "What happened to her?" "She fell." A pause, then quieter. "Somebody pushed her down the stairs at the courthouse. 3 weeks ago. Nobody saw anything." Rhett felt the temperature drop inside his chest. He looked at Deacon. Deacon's face was stone. "Can we come in?" Rhett asked. Sadie studied him for a long moment. Then she turned and opened the screen door, holding it with her shoulder the way a child does when the spring is too strong for her arms. The inside of the house smelled like instant coffee and rubbing alcohol and something else. The faint, unmistakable scent of fear. Old fear. The kind that seeps into wallpaper and carpet and stays long after the immediate danger has passed. The living room was small and painfully clean. A couch with a blanket folded precisely on one arm. A television that was off. A shelf of children's books organized by size. On the coffee table, a shoebox filled with papers. Letters, legal documents, photographs. A boy sat on the floor near the couch, drawing with crayons on the back of a paper grocery bag. 4 years old, maybe 5. He looked up when the bikers entered and his eyes went wide, but he didn't cry. He looked at Sadie first. She nodded at him. He went back to drawing. Owen, Sadie's brother. "Mom," Sadie called. "They came." A sound from the back of the house. Slow footsteps. The careful, measured movement of someone in pain. A woman appeared in the doorway of the hall, leaning on an aluminum crutch, her left arm in a sling that looked like it had been fashioned from a bedsheet. Lena Quinn. 32 years old, but looking 40. Dark circles under her eyes. A bruise on her jaw that was fading from purple to yellow. Hair pulled back tight. Wearing sweatpants and an oversized flannel shirt that probably belonged to someone who wasn't here anymore. She looked at the 7 men in her living room, and her face went through 3 expressions in 2 seconds. Fear, confusion, and then something harder. Anger. "Sadie," she said. Her voice was controlled in the way that a cracked dam is controlled. "What did you do?" "I gave them the map." "I told you not to." "You told me to find help. Nobody else came." The room went silent. Owen stopped drawing. Lena's hand tightened on the crutch until her knuckles turned white. She looked at Rhett, at his cut, his scars, the way he stood with his weight slightly forward, ready for anything, and something in her expression shifted. Not trust, not yet. Something closer to exhaustion. The look of someone who has been fighting alone for so long that even the wrong kind of help starts to look like a lifeline. "Who are you?" she said. Not a question, a demand. "Rhett Mercer, Iron Sentinels MC. Your daughter gave me this at the rally." He held up the map. She wrote, "Please come before tonight. I'd like to know what happens tonight." Lena closed her eyes. When she opened them, they were wet, but her voice was steady. "Sit down," she said. "All of you, this is going to take a minute." She lowered herself onto the couch with the careful deliberation of someone whose body has become an obstacle course. Sadie sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. Owen climbed onto the couch on the other side and pressed his face against his mother's hip. The bikers stood. Nobody sat. Deacon leaned against the door frame. Colt positioned himself near the front window, angled so he could see the street. The rest spread through the room in a formation that was unconscious and precise. Veterans who hadn't stopped scanning for threats just because the war had changed zip codes. Lena talked, and the story she told was the kind that makes you understand why some people stop believing in systems. 18 months ago, Graydon Hale Development Group announced plans to redevelop the entire Southgate neighborhood into a mixed-use commercial district. Shopping center, office space, a hotel. The kind of project that city councils love because it generates tax revenue and makes downtown look alive. The residents of Southgate, 47 families, mostly working class, mostly renters, some who had owned their homes for 3 generations, were told they would be fairly compensated and assisted with relocation. The compensation was a joke. Below-market offers delivered with deadlines that gave families 72 hours to accept. The relocation assistance was a photocopied list of apartments in towns 60 miles away. And when families refused to sell, the pressure began. Code violations that appeared overnight. Water shutoffs blamed on infrastructure maintenance. Police responding to noise complaints that nobody had filed. Property taxes reassessed at double or triple their previous value. One by one, families broke. Sold for pennies. Left. Lena hadn't sold because Lena had found something. She worked part-time as a paralegal at a small law firm in Carlo. 6 months ago, while filing paperwork for an unrelated case, she'd stumbled onto records showing that Graydon Hale had obtained its demolition permits through falsified environmental assessments. The land under Southgate had been flagged for potential contamination from the old factory. Contamination that, if properly documented, would require expensive remediation before any construction could begin. Graydon Hale had paid a consulting firm to produce clean reports. The consulting firm's owner sat on the city planning commission. Lena had copied the documents. She'd taken them to the county prosecutor. The county prosecutor had referred her to the state attorney general's office. The state attorney general's office had opened a file and told her they'd be in touch. That was 4 months ago. Nobody had been in touch. What had happened instead was this. Her car was vandalized. Her mailbox was torn off its post. Someone left a dead cat on her front porch. Her tires were slashed 3 times. The law firm fired her after receiving complaints about her work. Complaints she was never shown. Her landlord, who owned 17 properties in Southgate, all of which he'd already sold to Graydon Hale, began eviction proceedings. 3 weeks ago, she'd gone to the courthouse to file a formal complaint. On the way out, someone pushed her down a flight of concrete stairs. She broke her left wrist and cracked 2 ribs. The security camera in that stairwell had been out of service for maintenance. She filed a police report. The officer who took it told her, without looking up from his notepad, that stairwells were slippery and she should wear better shoes. Rhett listened to all of this without moving. His face showed nothing. But inside his chest, something was happening that he hadn't felt in years. A specific, focused rage that had nothing to do with violence and everything to do with recognition. He knew this story. Not the details. The shape of it. The architecture of institutional failure. Systems designed to protect people being weaponized against them. And at the center of it, a woman and 2 children who had done the right thing and been punished for it. "What happens tonight?" he said when she finished. Lena looked at Sadie. Sadie looked at her mother with an expression that said, "Tell them. Tell them or I will." "Yesterday," Lena said, "Sadie heard men talking outside our house. 2 of them. She was in the yard behind the fence." "I wasn't spying," Sadie said. "I was looking for Owen's ball." She heard them say that everything would be handled tonight, that the last houses on this block would be empty by morning. "How?" Deacon said from the doorway. Lena shook her head. "I don't know. Fire, break-in, something that looks like an accident. That's how they work. There was a house fire on Archer Street 2 months ago. Family of 4 got out in time, barely. Investigators called it electrical. The house was rewired 2 years ago." The room went very quiet. Outside, a dog barked somewhere down the block. 3 sharp sounds that echoed off empty houses and died. Colt spoke from the window without turning around. "How many families still on this street?" "6, Lena said. "Down from 22. Most of them are scared. Mrs. Barrera next door is 73 and lives alone. The Patels at the end of the block have a newborn. The others, they've been told they're on their own. The neighborhood association dissolved 6 months ago. There's nobody left to fight." "There's you," Rhett said. Lena looked at him. Something in her eyes cracked. Not hope, not yet, but the membrane that holds hopelessness in place. "I can barely walk," she said. "I have 2 children, no job, no car, and a stack of evidence that nobody will look at. I'm not fighting, I'm drowning." Rhett knelt down. Not in front of Lena, in front of Sadie. He looked the girl in the eyes, those creek water eyes that had picked him out of 300 strangers, and he said something that surprised even himself. "You drew the map," she nodded. "You chose who to give it to." Another nod. "Why me?" Sadie was quiet for a long time. Owen had stopped drawing and was watching them. Outside, the afternoon light was beginning to change, the shadows growing longer, the heat settling into something heavier. "Because you look sad," she said. "The other ones looked mean or looked happy. You looked sad. Sad people know what it feels like." Rhett stood up, his knee cracked. He looked at Deacon. Something passed between them. Not words, not a signal, just the compressed understanding of 2 men who had spent years reading each other in situations where speaking could get you killed. Deacon pushed off the doorframe, uncrossed his arms. "We're staying," Deacon said. It wasn't addressed to Lena. It was addressed to the room, to the house, to whatever was coming after dark. "You can't," Lena started. "Ma'am," Colt said from the window, still not turning around. "With respect, we've been in worse places than this. And the people who sent those men to your street, they're counting on you being alone tonight." He finally turned. His prosthetic hand caught the light. "You're not alone tonight." Lena pressed her lips together. Her eyes filled, but nothing fell. She pulled Sadie closer with her good arm and held her like the girl was the only solid thing left in a world that had gone liquid. Rhett walked outside. The air was thick and still, the kind of Midwest summer heat that sits on your chest like a hand. He stood on the crooked porch and looked down the street, 6 houses with people still in them, the rest hollow, empty windows like missing teeth. His phone buzzed, a text from a number he didn't recognize. 4 words. "Walk away. Last chance." He stared at the screen. The cursor blinked. He could feel his heartbeat in his scar. He didn't respond. He pocketed the phone and walked back inside. But as he crossed the threshold, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. Taped to the inside of the front door, half hidden by a jacket hanging from a hook, was a photograph. A man in a marine dress uniform, smiling, holding a baby girl in a yellow blanket. The man's face was younger but unmistakable. Rhett stopped. He knew that face. Not from Carlo, not from the rally. From a place he hadn't thought about in 6 years. A dusty room in Helmand Province. A voice on a radio that cut out mid-sentence. A name on a wall he'd visited once and sworn never to visit again. The man in the photograph was Staff Sergeant Ethan Quinn, killed in action, Sadie's father. And the last man Rhett had been ordered to protect, the man he'd failed. The floor beneath his boots felt suddenly unstable, as if the house itself was shifting. Sadie was watching him from the couch, her creekwater eyes, her father's eyes. She hadn't chosen him randomly. She hadn't chosen him because he looked sad. She'd chosen him because somewhere in the wreckage of a little girl's memory, a face glimpsed in a photograph, a name mentioned in a story her mother told when she thought the children were asleep, she recognized him. And now Rhett stood in the house of the man whose death he carried like a stone in his chest, looking at the daughter who had drawn a map to her own front door and handed it to the one person in the world who owed her father everything. The sun was going down, and someone had just promised that everything would be handled tonight. Rhett didn't move for a long time. The photograph on the back of the door held him the way a hand holds a throat, not squeezing yet, just reminding you it could. Staff Sergeant Ethan Quinn, 3rd Battalion, 6th Marines. Killed in action in Helmand Province on a Tuesday morning that smelled like diesel and copper and dust so fine it got into your lungs and never left. Rhett remembered the dust. He remembered the radio. He remembered Ethan's voice, calm, almost conversational, calling for support that was 11 minutes away. 11 minutes. In combat, 11 minutes is a lifetime. In this case, it was exactly a lifetime. Ethan Quinn's lifetime. The debrief had cleared Rhett. The after-action report used phrases like unavoidable delay and communication breakdown, and no individual fault. Clean language for a dirty truth. Rhett had been 200 yards away, pinned behind a wall with rounds cracking overhead, and he had made a decision. Hold position or move. He held. By the time the suppressive fire lifted and his team pushed forward, Ethan was on the ground with his hand still on the radio and his eyes looking at something none of them could see. No individual fault. Rhett had carried those 3 words like shrapnel, lodged too deep to remove. He'd left the Corps 6 months later. Moved to Carlo because it was nowhere. Found the Iron Sentinels because Deacon had found him first. Sitting in a bar at 2 in the afternoon, 3 bourbons deep, with the particular emptiness of a man who had stopped caring whether the next breath was worth taking. And now he stood in Ethan Quinn's house, looking at Ethan Quinn's daughter, the daughter who had walked through 300 strangers and chosen the man who had failed to save her father. Rhett, Deacon's voice, low, from behind him. Rhett turned. His face must have shown something because Deacon's eyes narrowed, a fractional shift that anyone else would have missed. Outside, Deacon said. Now. They stepped onto the porch. The sun was sitting on the rooftops now, bleeding orange and red across the empty street. The heat hadn't broken. Somewhere down the block, a screen door banged in the wind that wasn't there. Just the pressure change that comes before a storm that hasn't decided whether to arrive. Deacon lit a cigarette, cupped the flame with both hands, even though there was no wind, a habit from places where light could get you killed. He took a long drag and let the smoke leak out through his nose. You know her, he said. I know who her father was. That's not what I asked. Rhett looked at the street. A cat crossed the pavement 3 houses down, moving fast, the way animals move when they sense something humans can't. Ethan Quinn, Rhett said, 3rd Battalion. Helmand, 2018. Deacon smoked, waited. He was my responsibility, my section, my call. Rhett's voice was flat, stripped of everything except the facts. We took contact. I held position instead of pushing. He died before we reached him. You held position because pushing would have killed your whole team. That's what the report said. Is it true? I don't know anymore. I've run it 10,000 times. Some nights I think I was right. Some nights I think I was scared. Most nights, I think there's no difference. Deacon finished the cigarette, ground it under his boot heel on the warped porch boards. The ember died in a tiny constellation of sparks. Does she know? The girl? I don't know. Maybe. She said she chose me because I look sad, but when I saw that photo, he stopped, swallowed. She has his eyes, Deacon. So you're compromised. I'm standing here. That's not the same thing. Deacon turned to face him fully. In the dying light, his face looked carved from the same stone as the condemned buildings around them. You're not here to fix what happened in Helmand. You can't save a dead man by saving his kids. And if you think you can, you're going to make decisions with your guilt instead of your head, and people are going to get hurt. I've seen it before. I've done it before. Deacon's voice dropped half a register. You think I don't carry my own? You think every man in this club isn't dragging something behind him that weighs more than his bike? He leaned closer. But we don't ride into situations because of what we owe the dead. We ride because of what we owe the living. You understand the difference? Rhett didn't answer. Couldn't. Because the truth was he didn't understand the difference. Not right now. Not standing on this porch with Ethan Quinn's photograph behind him and Ethan Quinn's daughter inside, and the particular weight of a 6-year debt pressing on his sternum like a boot. Deacon read his silence. I'm keeping us here tonight, but I'm running this, not you. You're too close. Deacon, not a negotiation. He said it the way he said everything that was final, quietly, without emphasis, as if the words were stones being set into place. You stay with the family. Colt and Maceo take the street. Burke and Pike take the perimeter. Harlan and Dunaway run mobile. You do not engage anyone. You do not leave this house. You protect what's inside and you let me handle what's outside. And if it goes sideways? Deacon looked at him with something that might have been pity or might have been understanding. The two look identical on a face that's been through enough. Then it goes sideways and we deal with it, like we always do. He walked off the porch and into the failing light, his boots making no sound on the cracked concrete path. Rhett watched him cross the street to where the bikes were parked and begin speaking to the others in low tones, pointing, assigning positions, drawing a tactical map in the air with his hands. 6 men who had spent their lives in places where the rules didn't apply, running a neighborhood defense operation on a dead-end street in a town that had already given up. Rhett went back inside. Lena was in the kitchen, struggling to make coffee with one arm. The crutch leaned against the counter. She balanced against the edge of the sink while spooning instant coffee into mugs with shaking hands. "Let me," Rhett said. "I can do it." "I know you can. Let me anyway." She looked at him for a moment, measuring, deciding, then stepped aside. He found the kettle, filled it, set it on the stove. The burner clicked 3 times before it caught. The blue flame was the brightest thing in the room. "You saw the picture," Lena said. He didn't turn around. "Yeah." Sadie keeps it on the door so it's the last thing she sees when she leaves, and the first thing she sees when she comes home. A pause. She doesn't remember him. She was 2 when he died. Everything she knows about her father comes from stories I've told her and a box of letters in the closet. He was a good Marine. He was a good man. The Marine part got him killed. The kettle began to hiss. Rhett watched the water not yet boil. "Mrs. Quinn, Lena, there's something I need to tell you, and I need you to hear it before tonight." She went still. Not the stillness of calm, the stillness of someone bracing for impact. "I knew Ethan. We served together. I was—" The words caught. He forced them. "I was there when he died. Not close enough. But there." The kitchen was very quiet. The kettle hissed. A fly buzzed against the window screen with a sound like a tiny engine failing. "I know," Lena said. Rhett turned. "Ethan wrote about you," she said, "in his letters. Not by name. He called you the quiet one. Said you were the best point man in the battalion, but you never talked about it. Said if anything ever happened to him, the quiet one would take it hardest because he was the type who believed he could save everyone." She reached behind the shoebox on the counter, a different box, smaller, held together with a rubber band, and pulled out a folded letter. She didn't hand it to him. She held it against her chest. "After he died, I read every letter he ever sent me, over and over. And I hated the quiet one for a long time, years, because he survived and Ethan didn't, and that math never works out fair. It doesn't. Then I moved here, and things got bad. And I started to understand something Ethan wrote in his last letter, that you can't hate someone for surviving. You can only hate the situation that made surviving a matter of luck." She set the letter down on the counter. "Sadie didn't choose you by accident. She found your face in a photograph Ethan sent home. A group photo. 8 Marines in front of a vehicle. She's been carrying that photo in her backpack for 3 months, ever since things got dangerous. She told me that if she ever saw one of Daddy's friends, she would ask them for help." Rhett's vision blurred. He turned back to the stove, gripped the edge of the counter. The kettle screamed. He made the coffee. 4 mugs. His hands were steady because he willed them steady, the way he'd willed them steady on a rifle in places where steadiness was the difference between breathing and not. He carried 2 mugs to the living room where Sadie was reading to Owen from a picture book about a bear who couldn't find his way home. The domesticity of it, the small voice, the turning pages, the boy leaning against his sister, hit Rhett harder than any of the things Lena had told him. He set a mug on the coffee table. Sadie looked up. "Is it going to be okay?" she asked. "Yeah," he said. "It's going to be okay." It was the first lie he'd told in years. Or maybe it wasn't a lie. Maybe it was a promise he hadn't earned the right to make but was making anyway, because sometimes a promise is the only thing you can give a child who has already learned that the world doesn't keep its promises. Outside, the last of the daylight died. The street went dark. No streetlights. The city had removed them 8 months ago, citing maintenance reallocation. The only light came from the few remaining occupied houses, their windows glowing like scattered embers in a fire that was almost out. Rhett's phone buzzed again. Same unknown number. "We know who you are. We know about Helmand. Walk away, or everyone learns what you did." He stared at the message. His jaw tightened. They'd done their homework. Someone had connected him to Ethan Quinn, to this house, to the specific guilt that lived in his chest like a second heartbeat. They were using it, weaponizing it. The threat wasn't violence, it was exposure. The suggestion that in his failure, his hesitation, his 11 minutes of indecision would become public. That Lena would learn the details the after-action report had sanitized. That Sadie would know exactly how her father had died and exactly who had been too late. He deleted the message. His hand was not steady this time. At 9:15, Colt's voice came through the burner phone Deacon had distributed to each position. Low, clipped, professional. 2 vehicles. South end of Mill. Sitting dark. No plates visible. Deacon's response was immediate. "Hold position. Do not approach. Confirm occupants. 30 seconds. Then Colt again. 2 per vehicle. Front vehicle is a black SUV, commercial grade. Rear vehicle is a pickup. They're not moving, just sitting." "Surveillance or staging?" Maceo said from his position 2 blocks east. "If they're staging, there'll be a 3rd vehicle within the hour." "How do you know?" Harlan's voice, younger, tighter. Because that's how you run a pressure operation. 2 to watch, 1 to execute. We did it in Mosul. Different flag, same playbook. Rhett stood at the front window, looking through a gap in the curtain. He couldn't see the vehicles from this angle, but he could feel them. The way you feel eyes on you in a dark room. The street had a different quality now. Charged, waiting, like the air before a lightning strike. Behind him, Lena had moved the children to the back bedroom upstairs. He could hear her voice through the ceiling, reading to Owen, keeping her tone light in a way that cost her everything. At 9:40, Deacon called a conference on the burner line, all 7 men listening. His voice was the low, controlled monotone of a man who had briefed operations where the stakes were measured in body bags. "Listen up. Here's what we know and what we don't. We know Graydon Hale wants this street cleared. We know they've used intimidation, property damage, and at least 1 physical assault to move families out. We know someone told Lena Quinn that everything ends tonight. We know there are 2 vehicles staged at the south end of the street with 4 men in them. What we don't know is their timeline, their method, or whether they have law enforcement cooperation." "They do," Colt said. "The cops in this town couldn't find their own badge with both hands, but they damn sure know how to look the other way when a developer writes checks." Assumption noted. "Here's what we're going to do. We hold positions. We document everything. Phones on, video rolling. If they approach any occupied residence, we make ourselves visible. We do not initiate contact. We do not threaten. We do not touch anyone. We are witnesses. That's all." "And if they come in anyway?" Burke's voice. Rare. The big man almost never spoke on comms. "Then we're witnesses who happen to be standing in the way." There was a pause. Then Pike, quiet, sardonic Pike, who'd done 2 tours in Iraq and came home to find his wife had sold the house, said, "Standing in the way has a real specific feel to it when you're 6'2" and wearing a leather cut." "That's the idea," Deacon said, and ended the call. 10:15. The 3rd vehicle arrived. Maceo called it. White van. No markings. Just pulled up behind the pickup. 3 occupants, all male. One of them is carrying something. Toolbox or equipment case. Rhett's stomach tightened. A white van, an equipment case, and a street full of wooden houses in a neighborhood where a fire had already been staged to look like an accident. The math wasn't hard. "Deacon," he said into the phone, "I see it. That's an accelerant kit. You don't know that." "I know what a staged fire setup looks like. We saw it in Sangin. Insurgents used the same approach. Scout, stage, ignite, disappear. 3 vehicle protocol. Watch, execute, clean." A silence on the line. Then Deacon. "That's Afghanistan. This is Illinois. The tactics don't change because the zip code does." More silence. Rhett could hear Deacon breathing, could hear the night insects through the open channel, could hear distantly the sound of a television from the Barrera house next door. Mrs. Barrera, 73, living alone, probably watching a game show and not knowing that 3 vehicles full of men were parked 2 blocks away with plans for her street. "We need to warn the other families," Rhett said. "If we move, they'll see us. If they see us, they accelerate their timeline or they scatter and come back when we're gone. If we don't move, someone's house burns down. You're not running this. Deacon, listen to me. I said you're not running this." Hard now, the steel underneath the calm. We stay in position. We document. We let them make the first move. And if the first move is a match? The line went dead. Deacon had closed the channel. Rhett stood in the dark living room with the phone in his hand and a fury building in his chest that he hadn't felt since Helmand. The same fury, the same impotence, the same terrible geometry of knowing what was coming and being told to hold position. Hold position. Wait. Trust the plan. He'd trusted the plan once before. Ethan Quinn died. He walked to the back of the house, through the narrow kitchen, past the bathroom with its dripping faucet that counted seconds like a metronome, to the back door. He opened it and stepped into the yard. The yard was small and fenced, the chain link sagging in places where the posts had rusted through. Beyond it, an alley. Beyond the alley, the backs of houses on the next street, most of them dark, most of them empty. The air smelled like hot concrete and cut grass, and something else, something chemical that might have been his imagination. He called Maceo directly. Broke protocol. Didn't care. "The white van," he said. "Can you get a plate?" "Already ran it. Registered to a shell company. Traced back to a property management firm in Springfield. 3 layers deep, but the address matches a subsidiary of Graydon Hale." "You got all that in 20 minutes?" "I got all that in 12. I was intelligence, not infantry. Different skill set." A pause. "Rhett, Deacon's right. We need to let them move first." "Maceo, but Deacon's also wrong and he knows it. He's managing you because you're compromised, and he's managing the situation because he's careful, but careful doesn't work when the other side has kerosene and a schedule. So what do you suggest?" "Give me 15 minutes. I'm sending everything I've got. Plates, photos, shell company records, to a contact at the state fire marshal's office. If I can get a call on record before anything happens, it changes the legal landscape completely. Arson with a prior tip-off is a federal case, not a local one. And if your contact doesn't pick up, then we improvise. But Rhett, don't go rogue. Not tonight. You go out there alone and something happens to you, those kids upstairs lose the only connection to their father they have left." The words hit like a slap. Rhett leaned against the back wall of the house. The siding was rough against his shoulders. Above him, through the window of the back bedroom, he could hear Sadie's voice. Not reading anymore, just talking quietly to Owen in the dark. "And he's outside," she was saying. "The man from the picture. He's right outside. So nothing bad can happen." Rhett closed his eyes. 11:10. The street went absolutely still. No insects, no television from next door, no wind, the kind of silence that precedes something that can't be taken back. Then Colt's voice, barely a whisper. "They're moving, all 3 vehicles, heading north on Mill, toward us." Rhett went back inside, took position at the front window. Through the curtain gap, he could see headlights. 3 sets, moving slowly, no engines revving, the deliberate crawl of predators who know their prey can't run. Then all 3 sets of headlights went dark simultaneously. The vehicles kept moving. Shadows on shadows. The sound of tires on broken pavement, quiet as breath. They stopped in front of the Barrera house. Mrs. Barrera, 73, alone. A door opened. A figure stepped out. Then another. The white van's rear doors opened and 2 more figures emerged carrying something between them. Long, rectangular, the size of a duffel bag. Rhett's phone buzzed. Deacon. 1 word. Hold. He watched. Every muscle in his body pulled tight as a cable. His hand found the door handle. He didn't turn it. Not yet. Then a light came on in the Barrera house. A single window on the ground floor. And in that window, the silhouette of a small, stooped woman parting her curtains to see why there were vehicles in front of her house at 11 o'clock at night. One of the figures pointed at the window, said something to the others. They moved faster now. The duffel bag was carried to the side of the house, out of sight from the street. Rhett couldn't hold anymore. He opened the door. "Rhett, no!" Deacon's voice behind him. Not on the phone, in person. Deacon had crossed the street without making a sound and was standing on the porch close enough to grab him. You walk out there, you give them an excuse. Trespassing, intimidation, assault. They'll have lawyers and we'll have charges. They're going to burn that woman's house. Macio's call went through. Fire marshal is sending a unit. 15 minutes. She doesn't have 15 minutes. Deacon grabbed his arm. Not hard, but firm. The grip of a man who has physically stopped other men from walking into things that would destroy them. You are not dying on this street for the same reason you couldn't save Ethan Quinn. You held position then, and it was the right call. Hold position now. Rhett looked at Deacon's hand on his arm, looked at Deacon's face, saw the calculation there, genuine concern mixed with tactical assessment, mixed with something deeper, something that looked like fear. Not fear of the men on the street, fear of what Rhett would become if he walked out that door carrying 6 years of guilt like a loaded weapon. 15 minutes, Rhett said. 15 minutes. If that house catches fire before then, I'm going. If that house catches fire before then, we're all going. They stood on the porch in the dark. Two men watching shadows move around an old woman's house. The night pressed down on them like a hand. Somewhere far away, a siren. Maybe the fire marshal's unit. Maybe not. Maybe just the ordinary emergency of a town that was dying one block at a time. Then Sadie's voice from inside the house. Small, clear, carrying through the screen door like a bell in an empty room. "Mom, there are men outside Mrs. Barrera's house." And Lena's voice coming down the stairs, uneven, the crutch hitting each step. "Sadie, get your brother. Get the box from the closet, the one with the papers. Mom, now baby, right now." Rhett looked at Deacon. Deacon looked at the Barrera house. The side door of the old woman's house was opening, not from the outside, from the inside. Mrs. Barrera, 73 years old, 4'11", stood in her own doorway in a bathrobe and slippers, holding a cordless phone in one hand and a flashlight in the other, shining it directly into the face of the nearest figure. "I called the police," she said. Her voice carried across the night air with the particular authority of a woman who had survived things these men couldn't imagine. "I called my grandson, and I called the fire department. So whatever you're doing on my property, you've got about 60 seconds to stop doing it." The figure froze, turned to the others. A voice, low, male, muffled, said something Rhett couldn't make out. Movement, fast. The duffel bag was lifted, carried back toward the van. Doors opened and closed, an engine started, but not all of them moved. One figure remained, standing on the sidewalk in front of the Barrera house. Not retreating, not advancing, just standing there in the dark, looking directly across the street at Rhett's porch. The figure raised a phone. The screen glowed in the dark like a single pale eye. A photograph being taken, or a message being sent. Then the figure turned, walked to the remaining SUV, and got in. The vehicle pulled away without headlights, sliding through the dark street like something that lived in it. Rhett's phone buzzed one final time. The message was not from the unknown number. It was from Lena's phone, sent from inside the house, a photograph, the document she had pulled from the shoebox earlier, the records proving the falsified environmental assessments. But this version had something the original didn't, a sticky note attached to the front page, handwritten in block letters. "If something happens to us, this goes to Channel 7, the state AG, and every newspaper in Illinois. Copies already distributed." Below it, Lena had typed 3 words. "I'm done running." Rhett pocketed the phone, looked at Deacon. Deacon looked back. Behind them, inside the house, Lena stood at the bottom of the stairs with her children on either side. Sadie held a shoebox full of documents against her chest with both arms. Owen held his sister's hand. Lena's jaw was set. Her body braced against the crutch, her eyes dry and hard, and finished with every version of fear she'd carried for 18 months. Down the block, in 6 remaining houses, lights were coming on, one by one. Kitchen windows, porch lights, the Patels, the family on Archer Street, the couple 3 doors down whose name Rhett didn't know yet. Lights coming on in houses that had been dark for months, turned on by people who had heard an old woman stand in her doorway and refused to be afraid. Deacon looked at the lights, looked at Rhett, looked at Lena and her children. "Well," he said quietly, "there goes our exit strategy." And Rhett understood exactly what he meant. This was no longer a night watch, no longer a favor for a frightened kid with a map. The moment those lights came on, the moment Lena sent that message, the moment Mrs. Barrera shined her flashlight into a stranger's face, the Sentinels were in this. Not for a night, not until the threat passed. They were in this until it ended, one way or another, and the men who ran Graydon Hale would not let it end quietly. There was no road back. There was only the street and the people on it and the red X on a child's map that had stopped being a cry for help and become a line in the dirt. The lights stayed on all night. 6 houses on a dead-end street in a neighborhood the rest of Carlo had written off, and every single one of them burned electric until dawn like small defiant fires that refused to go out. Rhett sat in a kitchen chair by the front window of the Quinn house with a cold mug of coffee balanced on his knee, watching the street lighten from black to gray to the pale, exhausted yellow of a Midwest morning that didn't care what had happened in the dark. Sadie slept on the couch with Owen curled against her, both of them covered by a quilt that had been washed so many times the stitching showed through. Lena had not slept. He could hear her moving upstairs. The crutch, the slow footsteps, the creak of a floorboard, a pause, then the footsteps again, pacing. The restless orbit of a woman who had declared war and was now doing the math on what that war would cost. At 5:40, Deacon came through the back door smelling like cigarettes and motor oil and the particular staleness of a man who'd spent 7 hours standing in the dark. He set a folded newspaper on the kitchen table, the Carlo Gazette, morning edition, still damp from the delivery truck, and pointed at a story below the fold on the front page. Rhett read it. 3 paragraphs. Southgate redevelopment on track. Graydon Hale announces Phase 2 timeline. A quote from a city spokesperson praising the revitalization effort. A projected demolition start date, 14 days. No mention of remaining residents. No mention of opposition. No mention of a woman who'd been pushed down courthouse stairs or a 73-year-old who'd shined a flashlight into a stranger's face at 11 at night. 14 days, Rhett said. That's the public timeline. The real one is faster. Last night was supposed to clear the last holdouts. When it didn't work, they'll accelerate. How do you know? Because that's what I do. Deacon poured himself coffee from the pot Rhett had made 2 hours ago. It was burnt and bitter, and he drank it like water. Maceo's fire marshal contact came through. There's a report filed, but filed and acted on are 2 different things in a town where the developer sits on the planning commission. So the report sits in a drawer. Unless someone opens the drawer. Rhett looked at him. You have something. Deacon sat down across the table. In the early light, the lines on his face looked deeper, carved by something heavier than age. He wrapped both hands around the mug and stared into the coffee as if it owed him answers. Maceo traced the shell companies overnight, all 3 vehicles, the property management firm in Springfield, the subsidiary, the holding company. It's a clean operation, layers of corporate insulation designed to keep Graydon Hale's name off anything actionable. He paused, drank. But Maceo found a name, not on the corporate filings, on a payroll record for one of the shell companies. A security consultant, monthly retainer, $80,000 a year. Who? Deacon set his mug down. Nathan Cross. The name hit Rhett like a door swinging open onto empty space. He stared at Deacon. Deacon stared back. Neither of them moved. Nathan Cross, 45, former Marine, former Iron Sentinel, the man who had worn the same patch Rhett wore now, the shield split by lightning, for 9 years before Deacon had stripped it from his back in a vote that split the club down the middle and nearly destroyed it. That's not possible, Rhett said. Maceo confirmed it twice. Cross has been on Graydon Hale's payroll for 11 months. He runs their ground operations in Southgate. The intimidation, the surveillance, the pressure campaigns, all of it. Cross left 3 years ago. Cross was removed 3 years ago. There's a difference. And a man who gets removed from a brotherhood doesn't forget it. He just finds a different way to use the skills. Rhett pushed back from the table. His chair scraped the linoleum. The sound was harsh in the quiet kitchen. Through the doorway, he could see Sadie shift on the couch, pulling Owen closer, not waking. Nathan Cross. He ran through the name like running a hand over a scar. Cross had been the club's enforcer, not the sergeant-at-arms, which was a title with rules attached, but the unofficial position that exists in every organization where violence is a language, the man who speaks it fluently. He'd been good at it, too good. 3 years ago, a domestic situation involving a woman Cross had been seeing turned into something the club couldn't ignore. Broken jaw, orbital fracture, a hospital report that Cross had tried to make disappear. Deacon had called a vote. The vote passed by 1. Cross turned in his cut and walked out of the machine shop without a word. Nobody had heard from him since. Until now. He knows us, Rhett said. He knows how we think, how we deploy, how we operate. He knows every protocol we use. Yes. He's been watching us. Probably since last night, maybe before. If he's running Graydon Hale's ground operations in Southgate, he knows who lives on this street. He knows Lena's name. He knows what she has. He sent the texts. That would be my guess. We know about Helmond. Cross was in the club when you joined. He heard your story. He knows what lever to pull. Rhett felt something shift inside his chest. A realignment, like tectonic plates adjusting. This was not a faceless developer pushing families off a block. This was a man he'd sat across a table from, shared meals with, ridden beside for years. A man who knew the sound of every Sentinel engine, who knew their strengths and their fractures and their ghosts. Does the club know? Not yet. I'm telling you first because you need to hear it before the others do. When I tell Colt he's going to want to ride on Cross tonight, Colt's been carrying that vote for 3 years. He voted against removal. He thought we were wrong. He still thinks we were wrong. Colt voted to keep Cross? 1 vote. It was always 1 vote. And Colt has never said it out loud, but I've seen it in the way he looks at that empty chair at the table. He thinks we threw away a brother. Cross put a woman in the hospital. And Colt thinks people make mistakes, and brotherhoods don't abandon their own for 1 mistake. Deacon's voice was flat, presenting facts without endorsement. I'm not relitigating the vote. I'm telling you that when this information hits the club, it's going to fracture something. Cross isn't just an enemy. He's a wound we never stitched. The sun was fully up now, the kitchen filled with light that felt too honest for the conversation happening in it. Outside, a car passed on Mill Street. The first traffic of the morning, someone going to work, living a normal life on a normal day in a town that had a disease it didn't know about. Deacon called a meeting at 7, not at the Quinn house, at the Barrera house next door, because Mrs. Barrera had coffee that didn't come from a jar and a kitchen table big enough for 8 men, and she'd told Deacon at dawn that if those men were going to protect her street, the least she could do was feed them breakfast. The 7 sentinels sat around Alma Barrera's kitchen table eating scrambled eggs and toast, while she moved between the stove and the counter with the efficiency of a woman who had raised 5 children and buried 2 husbands and was not intimidated by men in leather vests. The kitchen smelled like butter and strong coffee and the faintly medicinal scent of the liniment she rubbed on her knees every morning. Deacon told them about Nathan Cross. The room reacted in stages. Burke's face went blank. The particular blankness of a large man containing something large. Harlan's legs started bouncing under the table. Pike and Dunaway exchanged a look that carried the weight of shared history. Maceo leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms, watching the others the way he always watched. Cataloging reactions, mapping alliances, preparing for the geometry of conflict. Colt didn't react at all. He sat with his prosthetic hand resting on the table and his real hand wrapped around a coffee mug and his eyes fixed on a point on the wall behind Deacon's head. Perfectly still. The stillness of a man who had just heard something he'd been expecting for 3 years. You knew, Deacon said. Colt's jaw worked. I didn't know he was working for Graydon Hale. But I knew he was still in Carlo. I've seen his truck twice in the past 6 months, once near the courthouse. once near the old plant on Route 9. And you didn't mention this. He's not a member anymore. What he does isn't club business. It became club business last night when his people tried to burn down this woman's house. Deacon's voice didn't rise, but the temperature in the room dropped. Mrs. Barrera, who had been pouring coffee, stopped, set the pot down, looked at Deacon with the particular attention of someone who understands that quiet anger is the dangerous kind. "You should have told me," Deacon said. "Maybe." Colt met his eyes. "And maybe if we hadn't thrown him out over one mistake, he wouldn't be on the other side of this table right now. He fractured a woman's face. And we've all done things. Every man at this table has blood somewhere he doesn't talk about. The difference is we had the club to keep us in line. Cross lost that, and he became what people become when they've got nobody holding the leash." The kitchen went silent. Mrs. Barrera quietly set down plates. Nobody touched them. Rhett watched Colt. Watched the tendons in his real hand flexing around the mug. Watched the prosthetic hand lying on the table like a piece of evidence. Colt had lost that hand, saving 3 Marines from a burning vehicle in Fallujah. He'd earned the right to his opinions through a currency that couldn't be counterfeited. But being right about sacrifice didn't make him right about Nathan Cross. "This isn't a debate about the vote," Rhett said. "Cross is running a criminal operation. He's using skills we taught him to terrorize families. Whatever he was before doesn't matter. What matters is what he's doing now." "Easy for you to say." Colt turned to him. His eyes were hard. "You've been here, what, 6 years? You didn't ride with Cross for 9? You didn't watch him pull a brother out of a ditch at 3 in the morning. You didn't see him sit with Danny Farrow's wife for 6 hours after Danny killed himself, just sitting there, not saying a word, because he knew that's what she needed." His voice cracked. Just barely. A fracture line in granite. "People are more than their worst night, and we made a decision based on his worst night and threw away everything else. His worst night put a woman in surgery, and your worst night put a Marine in the ground." The table went dead. Rhett felt the words enter his body like a blade. Not fast, but slow. The way a knife goes in when the person holding it wants you to feel every inch. Colt's face didn't change. He'd said it without heat, without cruelty, with the precision of a man who knew exactly where the wound was because he'd watched it form. Deacon's hand came down on the table. Once. Hard. The mugs rattled. Mrs. Barrera flinched. "Enough!" The word filled the room. Deacon looked at Colt, looked at Rhett, looked at every man at the table with the expression of a leader who has watched his unit begin to fracture and knows that the next 30 seconds will determine whether it holds. "We are not going to destroy each other before the enemy gets the chance. Colt, your loyalty to Cross is noted, and it changes nothing. He's on the other side. Rhett, your guilt is not a weapon anyone at this table gets to use. It's yours. Both of you put it away or leave this kitchen." Nobody left. Nobody spoke. Mrs. Barrera picked up the coffee pot and began refilling mugs as if nothing had happened, as if she'd spent a lifetime pouring coffee into the silence that follows men's arguments, knowing that the silence is where the healing happens or doesn't. Maceo broke it. "We have a tactical problem that isn't going to solve itself with feelings. Cross knows our playbook. He knows our positions. He probably has our phone numbers. Whatever we did last night, he's already adapted to. So we need to do something he doesn't expect." "Such as," Deacon said, "go public. Lena has evidence. Cross is on a payroll that connects to Graydon Hale. Combine them, and you have a story, not a police report. Those disappear. A story. Media, cameras, the kind of attention that makes it impossible for anyone to quietly make this street disappear. Lena's already tried. The state attorney general has been sitting on her complaint for 4 months. Because she's one woman with a stack of documents and no leverage. She's easy to ignore. But 6 families, a motorcycle club, a 73-year-old woman who confronted intruders on her own porch, and documentary evidence of corruption, that's not easy to ignore. That's a headline." Harlan spoke up. His voice was tight, younger than the others, carrying the nervous energy of a man who understood the theory but felt the danger in his bones. "And what happens when Cross figures out we're going public? He's not going to wait for a news crew to show up. He's going to move. Tonight. Tomorrow. Fast." "That's exactly right," Maceo said, "which is why we don't announce it. We do it now, today, before Cross can reposition. I have a contact at Channel 7 in Springfield, an investigative reporter who's been building a corruption series. I give her Lena's documents, the shell company records, the fire marshal report, and the payroll showing Cross's connection to Graydon Hale. She runs it within 48 hours. Without Lena's permission. Nothing runs without Lena's permission, but she sent that message last night. I'm done running. Take her at her word. Deacon considered. His fingers tapped the table, a slow, arrhythmic pattern that Rhett had learned to recognize as the sound of Deacon thinking through every possible outcome and its consequences. Tap, 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 tap. Silence. Do it, he said. But Cross is going to retaliate. So while Maceo works the media angle, the rest of us prepare this street for what's coming, and what's coming isn't going to be subtle. They dispersed. Burke and Pike went door to door on the street talking to the remaining families. Not scaring them, not pressuring them, just telling them what was happening and asking what they needed. The Patels, a young couple with a 3-month-old daughter, had been trying to sell their house for 7 months. No buyer would touch Southgate. They were trapped. They listened to Burke's quiet explanation, and the wife began to cry, and the husband put his arm around her and said, "We stay." The couple 3 doors down, Marcus and Diane Caldwell, both in their 60s, both retired from the factory that had closed, had a different reaction. Marcus went to his garage and came back with a box of tools and a roll of plywood and said, "Tell me what to board up." Diane started making sandwiches. By noon, the street had transformed. Not physically. The houses still sagged, the pavement still cracked, the condemned notices still fluttered on empty doors. But something in the air had changed. People were outside, talking to each other. Some for the first time in months. Mrs. Barrera sat on her porch with a glass of iced tea and watched the activity with an expression that was equal parts satisfaction and grief. The look of someone watching a neighborhood remember what it used to be while knowing it might not survive long enough to become that again. Rhett spent the morning with Lena. She sat at the kitchen table with the shoebox of documents spread out before her, organizing them into the narrative that Maceo would deliver to Channel 7. Receipts, emails she'd printed before her computer was stolen from her car, photographs of damage to her property, medical records from the emergency room, the falsified environmental assessments, a timeline she'd written by hand on a yellow legal pad, meticulous and damning. "You've been building this for months," Rhett said. "I've been building it since the day they pushed me down those stairs." She didn't look up. Her good hand moved across the papers with the precision of someone who had spent years as a paralegal, organizing, labeling, cross-referencing. "When nobody would listen, I decided to make it impossible to ignore. It could be dangerous when this hits the news, more dangerous than last night, more dangerous than watching men drive up to my neighbor's house with accelerants." She looked up then. Her eyes were clear and hard and finished with every calculation except one. The only thing more dangerous than going public is staying quiet. Quiet is what they're counting on. Quiet is what's been killing this street. Sadie appeared in the doorway. She'd changed out of the yellow dress into jeans and a t-shirt that said, "Carlo Elementary Field Day 2024," and sneakers that were starting to come apart at the soles. She was carrying a juice box and looking at the documents on the table with the expression of a child who understands that the papers represent something larger than paper. "Are they going to leave us alone now?" she asked. Lena reached for her, pulled her close, kissed the top of her head. "Not yet, baby, but we're going to make it very hard for them to keep doing what they've been doing." "Because of the map?" "Because of you. Because you were brave enough to ask for help." Sadie leaned against her mother and looked at Rhett. "Are you staying?" "Yeah, I'm staying." She nodded, finished her juice box, went back to the living room where Owen was building something out of couch cushions and shoe boxes that might have been a fort or a house or a motorcycle. It was hard to tell, and it didn't matter. What mattered was that a child was playing in a house where men had planned to end everything, and the playing itself was a kind of resistance. At 2:14, Maceo called. His voice was different. The controlled, analytical tone had been replaced by something tighter, something that sounded like a man recalibrating in real time. "We have a problem." Rhett put the phone on speaker. Lena stopped organizing. Deacon, who had been on the porch, came inside. I sent everything to my contact at Channel 7. She started digging. Within an hour, she hit a wall. The editor above her killed the story. No explanation, just, we're not running it. Move on. She pushed back. The editor told her, and I'm quoting, Graydon Hale is a significant advertising partner, and this story does not meet our editorial standards at this time. Silence. It gets worse, Mycio continued. While she was arguing with her editor, she ran a background check on Nathan Cross's security consulting firm. The firm has contracts with 3 other media outlets in the region, not advertising, security consulting. They provide risk assessment for newsrooms, meaning Cross's operation has a relationship with the very outlets that would cover this story. He's not just running intimidation on the ground, Deacon said. He's running information control. Full spectrum. Ground operations, legal pressure, media suppression. This isn't a local developer pushing out some families. This is a coordinated operation with the infrastructure to shut down every normal channel of accountability. Lena sat very still. Her hand rested on the stack of documents she'd spent months assembling. The evidence, the timeline, the proof. And Rhett watched something move through her face. Not defeat. Something worse. The realization that the enemy was larger, deeper, more entrenched than she'd imagined. That the walls she'd been pushing against weren't walls at all, but the edges of a machine designed to grind people like her into silence. So nobody runs the story, she said. Her voice was flat. Nobody local. But I'm not done. There are national outlets, independent journalists. The story is still a story. It just can't break through the local choke points. And while we find national outlets, Cross accelerates. He knows we're gathering evidence. He knows we tried to go to media. His people inside the newsroom will have told him by now. Deacon walked to the window, looked out at the street where Marcus Caldwell was nailing plywood over a broken window on an empty house, the hammer blows echoing like a slow heartbeat. We're running out of time and options simultaneously. At 4 o'clock, Rhett's phone rang. Not the burner, his personal phone. The caller ID showed a number he recognized. Nathan Cross. Rhett stared at the screen. 3 rings, 4, 5. Deacon watched him. Lena watched him. The phone kept ringing in the quiet kitchen, each ring louder than the last, filling the room with the sound of a past he couldn't outrun. He answered. Mercer. Cross's voice hadn't changed. Low, smooth, with a faint southern drawl he'd picked up from his mother in Virginia. The voice of a man who never raised it because he never needed to. It's been a while. Not long enough. Fair. Listen, I know what you're thinking, and I know what Deacon told you, and about half of it is true, and the other half is more complicated than a kitchen table conversation can handle. Which half is the woman you put in the hospital? A pause. The sound of a car engine idling, wind through an open window. That's the half that's true, and I've paid for it, more than the club knows, more than I'll explain to you over the phone. What do you want, Cross? A meeting, face to face, tonight, just you and me. I'll come alone. Neutral ground. The old loading dock behind the plant on Route 9. 9 o'clock. Why me? Because Deacon won't listen. Colt will listen, but he'll hear what he wants to hear. And you're the one in that house with those kids. You're the one who has the most to lose and the least to prove. I'm not your enemy, Mercer. The situation is more complicated than you think. And if you go to war without understanding who you're actually fighting, people are going to get hurt. Not my people. Yours. That woman. Those children. Rhett's hand tightened on the phone. Is that a threat? It's a fact. I've been inside Graydon Hale's operation for 11 months. I've seen things. Things that go beyond Southgate, beyond Carlo, beyond anything Lena Quinn's documents can prove. And I'm telling you, the man running this isn't who you think it is. Then who is it? 9 o'clock, loading dock. Come alone or don't come at all. But if you don't come, what happens next is on your shoulders. And you already know how that feels. The line went dead. Rhett set the phone on the table, looked at Deacon, looked at Lena. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, Marcus Caldwell's hammer had stopped. The street held its breath. It's a trap, Deacon said. Probably. Then you're not going. If it's not a trap, if Cross actually has information about who's running this, we need it. Maceo said we're fighting blind. Cross is offering to turn on the lights. Cross is offering to get you alone in a dark building where nobody can see what happens. I know what it looks like. You know what it is. Deacon stepped closer. He used Hellmond. He used the texts. He's using your guilt like a steering wheel. And now he's calling you directly, bypassing the club, offering intelligence that sounds exactly valuable enough to justify going alone. That's not honesty. That's tradecraft. Lena spoke. Go. Both men looked at her. He knows something. Whether he's lying about his intentions doesn't matter. The information matters. And if Rhett doesn't go, we lose whatever chance we have of understanding what we're actually facing. She looked at Rhett. But you don't go alone. You tell him you're coming alone. You bring someone he can't see. Rhett looked at her. This woman with a broken wrist and cracked ribs and 2 children sleeping in a house on a condemned street, and saw something that he hadn't expected. Not a victim. Not a client. A tactician. A woman who had spent 18 months fighting a machine designed to crush her, and who had learned, through pain and failure, and the particular education of being ignored by every institution meant to protect her, how to think like the people trying to destroy her. Maceo, Rhett said. Lena nodded. He's intelligence. He knows how to be invisible. He brings a camera, a recorder, and a phone connected to the state fire marshal's contact. Everything Cross says gets documented in real time. Deacon looked at Lena for a long moment. Then he looked at Rhett. Then he sat down at the table, pulled the cold coffee toward him, and drank it in one long swallow. If this goes wrong, he said, I will personally drag what's left of you back to this kitchen and let Mrs. Barrera lecture your corpse about making better decisions. Noted. 9 o'clock? 9 o'clock. Deacon stood, walked to the door, stopped. Without turning around, he said, Rhett, whatever Cross tells you, whatever he shows you, remember who you're doing this for. It's not Ethan Quinn. It's not yourself. It's the girl who drew the map. He left. The screen door closed behind him with a sound like a sentence ending. Rhett sat at the table across from Lena. Between them, the documents, the evidence, the timeline of a conspiracy that had started as a real estate play and become something larger. Somewhere in this town, Nathan Cross was sitting in a vehicle, making calls, moving pieces on a board that Rhett couldn't see. Sadie appeared in the doorway again. This time, she wasn't carrying a juice box. She was carrying the photograph, the group photo of 8 Marines in front of a vehicle in Helmand Province. She'd taken it from her backpack. She held it out to Rhett. That's you, she said, pointing to the second figure from the left. And that's my dad. Her finger moved to the man in the center, smiling, squinting against the sun. And that's the man who called you. Rhett took the photograph, looked at it. 8 faces. 8 men who had trusted each other in a place where trust was measured in seconds and paid for in blood. And there, on the far right, leaning against the vehicle with his arms crossed and his face half turned from the camera, Nathan Cross. Cross had served with Ethan Quinn. Cross had known Sadie's father, and Cross was working for the people trying to destroy Sadie's home. Rhett set the photograph on the table next to the documents and the cold coffee and the map with the red X. 3 artifacts from 3 different moments in time. A war, a conspiracy, a child's desperate plea, all converging on this kitchen, this street, this night. He looked at Sadie. I have to go somewhere tonight. I'll be back. Promise? The word hung in the air between them. Heavy, loaded with every promise that had ever been broken in her short life. The promise that her father would come home. The promise that someone would help. The promise that the systems designed to protect children would actually protect this one. Promise, he said. And 5 hours from now, standing in the dark of an abandoned loading dock with rain beginning to fall and the smell of rust and old concrete filling his lungs, he would discover that the truth Nathan Cross had to tell was worse than any lie. That the man behind Graydon Hale wasn't a faceless developer at all, but a name Rhett knew, a name the whole club knew, a name that would tear the Iron Sentinels apart from the inside and force Rhett to become something he had spent 6 years trying not to be. The man he was before Helmand. The man who didn't hold position. The man who moved. The loading dock behind the old Carlo industrial plant was a skeleton of rusted steel and cracked concrete that hadn't seen a working truck in 4 years. Rain had started 20 minutes ago. Not the gentle kind, but the flat, heavy Midwest rain that comes down like a punishment, turning the broken pavement into shallow rivers and drumming against the corrugated metal roof with a sound like 1,000 fingers tapping. Red arrived at 8:50, killed his engine, sat on his bike in the rain and let it soak through his cut, through his shirt, down to skin that was already cold. The loading dock stretched out before him. 3 bays, their rolling doors frozen half open like mouths caught mid-sentence. Beyond them, darkness. The plant's interior was a cavern of dismantled machinery and pooled water, and the particular smell of industrial decay, oil and rust and concrete dust, and the ghost of whatever this place used to make before the world decided it didn't need it anymore. Maceo was already in position. They'd agreed on the plan 2 hours ago. Maceo had arrived on foot from the east side, carrying a backpack with a digital recorder, a camera with a night lens, and a phone hardwired to record and transmit simultaneously. He was somewhere in the scaffolding above Bay 2, invisible, silent, watching. The kind of man who could disappear into a room the way smoke disappears into air. At 9:03, headlights swept across the lot. A black truck, late model, lifted, the kind of vehicle that costs money and wants you to know it. It pulled in 40 yards from Rhett's bike and stopped. The engine idled for 30 seconds. Then it cut. Nathan Cross stepped out. He looked the same and he didn't. Same height, 6 feet, lean, the build of a distance runner, not a fighter, which had always been deceptive because Cross could fight in ways that didn't require size. Same dark hair, shorter now, military neat. Same way of moving, fluid, unhurried, each step placed with the precision of someone who'd spent years navigating ground that could kill you if you stepped wrong. But something in his face had changed. The eyes were harder, deeper set, carrying a weight that hadn't been there 3 years ago. He wore no cut, no insignia. A black rain jacket and dark jeans and boots that were meant for work, not style. He walked toward Rhett with his hands visible, palms out, fingers open. The universal gesture of a man who wants you to see he's not holding anything. He stopped 10 feet away. Rain ran down both their faces. "You came," Cross said. "You called." "Alone?" "You said alone." Cross looked at the loading dock, looked at the scaffolding, looked at the shadows that could hold 100 men or none. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. A fractional tightening, the body's acknowledgement that trust was a luxury neither of them could afford. "Let's get out of the rain," he said. They moved under the overhang of Bay 1. The rain hammered the metal above them. Water sheeted off the edge in a curtain that turned the parking lot into a blur. Inside the bay, the darkness was thick, but not total. Enough ambient light leaked through broken windows to turn everything into shades of gray and black. Cross leaned against a concrete pillar, crossed his arms, looked at Rhett the way a man looks at a photograph of someone he used to know. "How's Deacon?" "Not interested in small talk, Cross." "Fair?" He uncrossed his arms, reached into his jacket. Rhett's body went tight. Every muscle, every nerve, the full body alarm of a man who has been trained to read threat in the smallest motion. Cross noticed, slowed his hand, pulled out a phone. "Relax, Mercer. If I wanted to hurt you, I wouldn't have called first." "The texts you sent said otherwise." "The texts were a mistake. I was trying to scare you off before you got too deep. I know how that sounds. It sounds like a lie. But I'm going to tell you something, and you're going to have to decide for yourself whether it's true." He unlocked the phone, scrolled through something, turned the screen toward Rhett. On it was a photograph, a document, shot at an angle as if taken quickly, covertly. A contract. Legal language, dense paragraphs, signatures at the bottom. The header read, Graydon Hale Development Group, Operational Partnership Agreement. And the co-signatory, the name on the second line, the partner who had invested $2 million into the Southgate redevelopment project in exchange for 30% of all commercial revenue generated by the completed development, was Victor Hargrove. Rhett stared at the name. Victor Hargrove, 59. Former Marine Colonel, current owner of Hargrove Security Solutions, a private military contracting firm that operated out of St. Louis, a man who sat on the boards of 3 veterans organizations, a man who gave speeches at Memorial Day events and shook hands with senators and posed for photographs with wounded warriors, a man who had been Deacon Wolf's commanding officer in Afghanistan, a man who had written the letter of recommendation that helped Deacon avoid a dishonorable discharge after the incident that no one in the club discussed, a man who, as far as anyone in the Iron Sentinels knew, was an ally, a friend, a brother in the oldest sense of the word. "That's not possible," Rhett said. "I've been inside the operation for 11 months. Hargrove brought me in. Not Graydon Hale. Hargrove. He recruited me 6 months after Deacon stripped my patch, found me in a bar in Springfield, bought me a drink, told me he understood what it felt like to be discarded by the people who were supposed to have your back. He offered me work, real money. I took it because I had nothing and nobody, and the kind of anger that makes you say yes to things you shouldn't. You're telling me you're a victim. I'm telling you I'm complicit. There's a difference. I ran the ground operations, the intimidation, the pressure. I did it because Hargrove told me it was a standard real estate play. Push out squatters, clean up a blighted neighborhood, create something better. By the time I understood what was really happening, the falsified assessments, the contaminated land, the plan to build on ground that would poison everyone who lived or worked there, I was in too deep to walk away without ending up in a cell or a ditch." Rhett's mind was racing. Hargrove. The name kept detonating in his head like successive charges, each one revealing a new layer of wreckage. If Hargrove was behind Graydon Hale, then the entire operation wasn't just a local land grab. It was a project run by a man with military intelligence connections, private security resources, and a personal relationship with the president of the Iron Sentinels. Does Deacon know? No, and that's why I called you. Because when Deacon finds out that the man who saved his career, the man he considers a mentor, is the same man who pushed a woman down a flight of stairs and tried to burn an old lady's house, it's going to break him. And a broken leader makes broken decisions. Why should I believe any of this? Cross put the phone away, looked at Rhett with an expression that stripped away every layer of protection and left something raw underneath. Not quite honesty, but the desperate cousin of it. Because I served with Ethan Quinn, because I was in Helmand, because I know what you carry and I carry the same thing in a different shape, and because Sadie Quinn drew a map and gave it to you, and that little girl doesn't deserve to lose her home because men like us can't figure out how to stop men like Hargrove. The rain intensified. Water began to pool on the loading dock floor, spreading toward their boots. Somewhere inside the plant, metal groaned shut, the building shifting in the cold, or the wind finding a passage, or something else. "What do you want?" Rhett said. "I want out, and I want to bring Hargrove down on my way. I have documents, contracts, communications, enough to build a federal case, racketeering, fraud, environmental crimes. But I can't take it to law enforcement because Hargrove has contacts in every local and state agency. It needs to go federal, and it needs to come from someone who isn't me, because the moment I surface as a source, Hargrove will have me killed and call it a training accident. You want the club to be your shield. I want the club to be what it's supposed to be, what it was before Deacon kicked me out and Hargrove picked me up. A brotherhood that protects people who can't protect themselves." His voice cracked on the last word. "Not performance. Damage. The sound of a man who has been living inside an enemy's operation for 11 months and has forgotten what it feels like to say something true." Rhett stood in the dark and the rain and the ruins of a factory that used to employ half this town and felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him like the sky itself was lowering. Cross could be lying. Every word could be a trap designed to fracture the club from within. Plant Hargrove's name, watch Deacon shatter, and move in while the pieces were still falling. That's what Deacon would say. That's what the smart move was. Walk away, report back, let the club decide. But Rhett looked at the photograph on Cross's phone one more time, and the signature on the contract was real. He knew Hargrove's handwriting. He'd seen it on the commendation letters that hung in Deacon's office at the machine shop, the same angular script, the same sharp downstroke on the H. "Give me everything," Rhett said. "Every document, every communication, everything you have." Cross reached into his truck and pulled out a hard case, the kind used for sensitive electronics. Inside was a laptop and 2 external drives. He handed it to Rhett. "There's something else," Cross said. "Tomorrow night, Hargrove is coming to Carlo. He's meeting with the Graydon Hale board to authorize the final phase, the demolition order for Southgate. Once that order is signed, it's legal. The city already approved the permits. The families will have 72 hours to vacate and no legal standing to fight." "Where's the meeting?" "The Graydon Hale offices, downtown, 8 p.m. "That gives us 24 hours. "That gives you 24 hours. I'm gone after tonight. If Hargrove finds out I've talked to you, I'm dead before morning." Cross turned toward his truck, stopped, looked back over his shoulder. The rain had plastered his hair to his skull, and his face looked skeletal in the dim light. The face of a man standing at the edge of something he couldn't come back from. "Tell Colt I'm sorry," he said. "Not for what I did, for what I became after." He got in his truck. The engine started. The headlights came on, cutting through the rain like blades. The truck reversed, turned, and disappeared down the service road, its taillights fading into the storm like dying embers. Maceo emerged from the scaffolding. Wet. Silent. He held up the recorder. "Got everything," he said. "Every word." They rode back to Mill Street through rain so heavy the road disappeared beneath it. Rhett's headlight carved a tunnel through the dark and the water, and the hard case was strapped to his passenger seat with bungee cords. And inside it was enough evidence to destroy a man who had spent 30 years building a reputation as a patriot and a protector. The irony tasted like copper in his mouth. They reached the Quinn house at 10:40. The lights were still on. All 6 houses. Deacon met them on the porch. Rhett handed him the hard case without speaking, went inside, found Lena at the kitchen table, exactly where he'd left her, as if she hadn't moved, as if she'd been sitting there for 3 hours holding the world in place through sheer force of stillness. "It's Hargrove," he said. Lena didn't react. She looked at him with an expression that told him she didn't know the name. "Victor Hargrove. He's a private military contractor. He's the money behind Graydon Hale. He's the one who ordered everything, the pressure, the harassment, the assault, the fire. And he's coming to Carlo tomorrow night to sign the demolition order." Lena absorbed this, processed it. Her face went through a sequence of emotions too fast to catalog. Anger, fear, calculation, resolve, and landed on something that looked like granite. "Then we stop him tomorrow night." Deacon came inside. He'd opened the hard case on the porch. His face was the color of old concrete. He set the case on the table next to Lena's documents and looked at Rhett with eyes that had been gutted. "You're sure?" "Cross showed me the contract, Hargrove's signature. Maceo recorded everything. The drives have communications going back 18 months. Deacon sat down. He put his hands flat on the table. They were shaking. Rhett had never seen Deacon's hands shake. Not in a bar fight. Not in a standoff with a rival club. Not in the moments after he'd told the story of his federal time. The one and only time. To the club at 3 a.m. with a bottle of bourbon between them. "Hargrove wrote the letter," Deacon said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "After what happened overseas. After the investigation. They were going to bury me. Dishonorable discharge, loss of benefits, possible charges. Hargrove stepped in. Wrote a letter to the review board. Called in favors. Got me an honorable separation and my full benefits. He said..." Deacon stopped, swallowed. "He said a man's worst moment shouldn't define his entire life." The words hung in the kitchen. Rhett thought of Colt, sitting at Mrs. Barrera's table that morning, saying almost the same thing about Nathan Cross. People are more than their worst night. The same philosophy, the same mercy, used by different men for different purposes. One to hold a brotherhood together, the other to build an empire on contaminated ground. "He used that," Rhett said. "Not cruelly, gently, the way you'd tell someone that the person they loved had been lying. He saved you so he'd have you, so that if he ever needed the Iron Sentinels to stay away from Southgate, he could call in the debt. He never called. He didn't need to. He just needed to know that if it came down to it, you'd hesitate, and hesitation is all men like Hargrove need." Deacon looked at his hands, still shaking. He pressed them flat against the table until the tremor stopped, not because it passed, but because he forced it into the wood, transferred it out of his body through sheer will. "Call the club," he said. "Everyone, now." By midnight, all 7 sentinels were in the Quinn living room. Sadie and Owen were upstairs, asleep, or pretending to be asleep, which for children in crisis amounts to the same thing. Lena sat on the couch with her documents and the hard case open on the coffee table. Maceo played the recording of Cross's confession. Every word, every pause, every crack in a broken man's voice. When it was done, the room was silent for a long time. Colt spoke first. "He said to tell me he was sorry." "Yeah," Colt nodded. "Once, then again." His prosthetic hand opened and closed, a reflex, mechanical, the ghost of fingers that weren't there gripping something that couldn't be held. "What's the plan?" Burke asked. Burke, who never spoke unless the speaking mattered. Burke, whose voice filled a room the way his body filled a doorway. Completely. Deacon stood. He looked at each man. His hands were steady now. Whatever had broken in the kitchen had been rebuilt. Not the same shape, not the same strength, but rebuilt. Hargrove arrives tomorrow night at 8 for a meeting at the Graydon Hale offices. He's signing a demolition order that will legally end Southgate. Once that order is signed, we lose. The families have 72 hours and no legal standing. "So we stop the meeting," Harlan said. "We don't stop the meeting. We let it happen. And we make sure that when Hargrove walks out of that building with his name on a demolition order for a contaminated neighborhood, every camera in Central Illinois is pointing at him." Maceo leaned forward. "My contact at Channel 7 got killed locally, but I've been working another angle, national, an investigative podcast with 3 million subscribers that specializes in corruption cases. They want the story. They want it live. They're sending a crew tomorrow. A podcast crew isn't the same as network news. In 2026, it's better. No editorial board, no advertising relationships, no kill switch. They go live and it hits social media simultaneously. By the time Hargrove's lawyers can draft a cease and desist, 10 million people have seen his face next to the environmental reports and the payroll records and the photograph of Lena Quinn at the bottom of a courthouse stairwell." "And the federal angle?" Deacon asked. "Cross's drives have enough for a RICO case. I've already sent copies, encrypted, to the FBI field office in Springfield and the EPA's criminal division. Even if Hargrove buries it locally, the federal trail is lit. It can't be unlit." Rhett listened to the plan take shape and felt something shifting beneath it. Not the plan itself, which was solid, but the ground it was built on. They were betting everything on exposure, on cameras and journalists and the faith that public attention could do what police and prosecutors and attorneys general had refused to do. It was a fragile bet. Hargrove had survived exposure before. The man had navigated military investigations and congressional inquiries and come out clean every time. He knew how to manage a narrative. He knew how to turn a story. "It's not enough," Rhett said. Everyone looked at him. "The media angle is the right play, but Hargrove will adapt. He'll have lawyers at the meeting. He'll have a PR team on standby. The moment cameras appear, he'll shut down, walk out, and release a statement calling it a coordinated smear by a motorcycle gang with a grudge. And half the public will believe him because he looks like a patriot and we look like outlaws." "So what do you suggest?" "The residents. Every family still on this street. Every family that was forced out. They need to be there. Not watching, standing, in front of the Graydon Hale offices. On the sidewalk, on the street, holding the documents, holding the photographs, holding the evidence that this man stole their homes and poisoned their land. Hargrove can dismiss a motorcycle club. He can't dismiss the people he destroyed." Lena stood up, the crutch under her arm, her jaw set. "I know where to find them. Every family that left Southgate in the past 18 months. I have their contact information. I've been keeping a list because somebody had to remember that they existed." "How many?" 31 families. Some moved across town, some moved to the next county. 2 moved out of state. But they'll come. They'll come because they've been waiting for someone to tell them it wasn't their fault and it wasn't over. The next 20 hours were a controlled frenzy. Maceo coordinated with the podcast crew. Lena made phone calls, dozens of them, from the kitchen of a condemned house, on a phone with a cracked screen, calling families who had been scattered by the same machine that was trying to scatter her. Some answered immediately, some took convincing, some cried, some swore. All of them said yes. Burke and Pike drove to Springfield and back, delivering copies of the evidence to the FBI field office in person because digital copies could be intercepted and Hargrove's reach was longer than anyone wanted to admit. Harlan and Dunaway canvassed the remaining Southgate families, coordinating logistics, who needed rides, who needed childcare, who needed to be reminded that showing up was not the same as being alone. Colt spent the day in the garage of the machine shop, alone, not speaking to anyone. Rhett found him at 4 p.m, sitting on a crate with a disassembled carburetor in front of him, his prosthetic hand resting on his knee, while his real hand held a wrench he wasn't using. "You good?" Rhett asked. "No." Colt didn't look up. "Cross called me last night, after he talked to you, 3 a.m. I didn't answer." "What did he want?" "Left a voicemail. Said he wished things had been different. Said he was sorry about the woman. Not in a way that sounded like he was making excuses, but in a way that sounded like a man who'd spent 3 years in the dark with what he'd done." He set the wrench down. "I voted to keep him. I thought we were wrong to cut him loose. And now I find out that if we'd kept him, he'd have been inside the club when Hargrove came calling. He'd have had the patch on his back and access to everything we are. Deacon was right, and I spent 3 years resenting him for it." Being wrong about one thing doesn't make you wrong about everything. It does when the one thing is the thing that mattered. Rhett sat down on a crate across from him. The garage smelled like motor oil and metal shavings and the cold coffee that sat in a mug on Burke's workbench, untouched since morning. "Colt, tonight is going to be hard. Deacon needs every man locked in, including you, especially you. You're the sergeant at arms. When people look at this club, they look at you to know whether it's safe to stand behind us. Can you do that?" Colt picked up the wrench, turned it in his hand. The prosthetic fingers didn't grip. They stabilized, held things in place while the real hand did the work, a metaphor he'd never asked for. "Yeah," he said, "I can do that." By 7:30, the street in front of the Graydon Hale offices was filling, not with bikers, with families. They came in minivans and sedans and pickup trucks, and one couple arrived on a bus from 2 counties away. They carried boxes of documents and framed photographs of their homes and handwritten signs that said things like, "This was my grandmother's house," and 30 years on Mill Street and contaminated land, falsified reports. 31 families, over 100 people, children, grandparents, a woman in a wheelchair, a man in a Marine Corps cap who'd served with Ethan Quinn and had driven 4 hours when Lena called. The podcast crew set up on the sidewalk, 3 people with cameras, microphones, and a live satellite uplink that would push the feed to every social media platform simultaneously. The reporter, a woman named Kessler, who had broken corruption stories in 3 states, looked at the growing crowd and said to her producer, "This is going to be big." The Iron Sentinels arrived at 7:45, 7 bikes in formation. The sound of their engines rolled down the street like a wave, and the families on the sidewalk turned to watch. Some of them had never seen a motorcycle club up close. Some of them looked nervous. Then Mrs. Barrera, who had ridden in Marcus Caldwell's truck, sitting in the passenger seat with her iced tea and her reading glasses, walked over to Deacon, took his arm, and said, "These are the men who stood on our street. These are the men who stayed." The nervousness evaporated. Someone started clapping, then someone else. The sound spread through the crowd. Not applause exactly, but something closer to recognition. The acknowledgement that alliances form in strange places, and that the people who show up when no one else will are the people you trust, regardless of what they wear or how they arrive. At 7:55, a black sedan pulled into the Graydon Hale parking garage. Tinted windows, government plates, and inside, visible for just a moment as the car passed under the garage lights, the silver-haired profile of Victor Hargrove. Rhett watched the car disappear into the garage. His heart was pounding. Not fear, focus. The concentrated intensity of a man who has spent 24 hours building toward a single moment and can feel that moment arriving like a train. His phone buzzed. "Maceo. FBI Springfield just confirmed. 2 agents en route. ETA 30 minutes. 30 minutes. The meeting was starting now. Hargrove was in the building. The demolition order was on a table somewhere above them, waiting for a signature that would legally erase Southgate from the map. They had 30 minutes to make sure that signature never landed. Deacon gathered the club. 7 men in a tight circle on the sidewalk, the crowd behind them, the cameras rolling. The rain from last night replaced by a sky that was clear and hard and full of stars that didn't care what happened below them. "This is it," Deacon said. "We don't go in, we don't confront, we stand. We let the cameras do their work and we let the people do their talking. When Hargrove comes out, he walks into a crowd of every family he's destroyed and a live feed that's going to every screen in the country. That's the play. That's the only play." He looked at Rhett. "Anything to add?" Rhett looked at the crowd, found Lena standing near the entrance with her crutch and her sling and her jaw set like a fortification. Found Sadie beside her, holding Owen's hand, holding the map with the red X. The map that had started everything. "Yeah," he said. "Don't blink." At 8:12, the front doors of the Graydon Hale building opened. 3 men in suits emerged, lawyers by the look of them, checking the street, seeing the crowd, the cameras, the motorcycles. One of them pulled out a phone, made a call, spoke rapidly, listened. His face went white. At 8:14, the doors opened again. Victor Hargrove stepped out. He was exactly what his photograph showed. Tall, straight-backed, silver-haired, wearing a dark suit that cost more than any house on Mill Street. The face of authority, the bearing of command. He took 2 steps onto the sidewalk, saw the crowd, saw the cameras, saw the iron sentinels standing in a line across the street, and stopped. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. The crowd held its breath. The cameras rolled. The night pressed in from every side, and the only sound was the distant rumble of engines. Not the sentinels' bikes, but something else. Something coming from the direction of Southgate, growing louder. Then Lena Quinn stepped forward. 1 step. 2. The crutch clicking on concrete. She stopped 10 feet from Victor Hargrove and held up a single document, the falsified environmental assessment with his signature on the partnership agreement stapled behind it. "My name is Lena Quinn," she said. Her voice carried across the crowd, across the cameras, across the night. "I live at 1847 Mill Street in the Southgate neighborhood of Carlow, Illinois. And this man," she pointed at Hargrove, "paid to poison my street, destroy my home, and silence everyone who tried to stop him." The crowd erupted. Not violence, voices. 31 families shouting their addresses, their stories, their evidence. Phones rose. Cameras flashed. The podcast feed went live, and within 60 seconds, 12,000 people were watching. Within 5 minutes, 100,000. Hargrove's lawyers closed around him. One of them was shouting into a phone, another was trying to push through the crowd toward the parking garage. But the crowd wasn't threatening, it was witnessing, standing, holding documents, holding photographs, holding the truth in their hands and refusing to let it be taken. And then the sound from Southgate arrived. Not engines, voices. The residents who had stayed on Mill Street, the ones who couldn't make it downtown, had come out of their houses and were standing in their yards, in their streets, on their porches. Someone had set up a phone on a tripod, and they were streaming their own feed. 6 houses with their lights blazing, people standing in front of them with their arms linked, and Mrs. Barrera's voice coming through a speaker someone had rigged to a car battery. "We are still here. We are still here. We are still here." The 2 feeds merged online, downtown and Southgate. The families who had left and the families who had stayed, the evidence and the witnesses. The story that no local newsroom would run was now running itself, carried by the voices of the people it belonged to. Hargrove broke. Not visibly. He was too controlled for that. But Rhett saw it. A micro-expression. A fracture in the facade. The moment when a man who has controlled every narrative for 30 years realizes that this narrative has slipped beyond his reach. He turned to go back inside. The door was locked. His own lawyers had sealed the building. He was standing on a sidewalk in a small Midwest town with 100 people and a dozen cameras, and nowhere to go. And for the first time in his career, Victor Hargrove had no exit strategy. Rhett's phone buzzed one last time. Maceo, 2 words. "FBI's here." Blue lights appeared at the end of the block. Two sedans, moving slowly through the crowd, unhurried, inevitable. The way the law moves when it finally decides to move. And at the center of it all, holding her brother's hand with one arm and the map with the other, Sadie Quinn stood under the streetlights and watched the man who had tried to erase her home learn what it felt like to be the one with nowhere left to run. The red X on her map faced outward, visible to every camera, and the crayon line that had torn through the paper caught the light and held it, a small, ragged wound in a piece of notebook paper that had become the most important document in Carlow, Illinois. The crowd kept chanting, the cameras kept rolling, the blue lights kept coming. And Rhett Mercer, standing in the line of bikers who had followed a child's map to a forgotten street and refused to leave, felt something crack open in his chest that he had kept sealed for 6 years. Not guilt, not grief, but the terrifying, unbearable possibility that he might have finally done something right. The FBI agents moved through the crowd the way a river moves through a canyon, unhurried, inevitable, reshaping everything they touched without raising their voices. Two men in dark suits with badges on their belts, and the particular calm of federal officers who have driven 4 hours to do something they've been preparing to do for weeks. They didn't rush. They didn't need to. The crowd parted for them the way crowds always part for authority that has finally arrived. With relief, with anger, with the exhausted question that nobody said out loud, but everyone was thinking, what took you so long? The lead agent, a woman Rhett hadn't noticed at first. She'd been in the second sedan, shorter, compact, with the kind of face that you forget until you realize she's already standing in front of the person she came for, walked directly to Victor Hargrove. She didn't introduce herself to the crowd. She didn't address the cameras. She spoke to Hargrove in a voice too low for anyone to hear, and Rhett watched Hargrove's face go through a transformation that was almost geological. The controlled exterior cracking, fissuring, revealing strata of calculation beneath. Hargrove said something. The agent said something back. One of Hargrove's lawyers stepped forward, and the agent raised her hand, not dramatically, just a palm, held steady at chest height, and the lawyer stopped as if he'd walked into glass. Then it was over. Not with handcuffs. Not with a dramatic arrest. Hargrove walked to the federal sedan flanked by both agents, got in the back seat, and the door closed. The sedan pulled away through the crowd, and the man who had tried to erase an entire neighborhood from the map of Carlow, Illinois, disappeared into the night as quietly as he'd arrived. The crowd didn't cheer. That surprised Rhett. He'd expected noise, celebration, release, the cathartic eruption of people who'd been holding their breath for months. Instead, there was a beat of silence so complete he could hear the podcast producer whispering into her headset. Then Lena Quinn sat down on the curb. Not a collapse, a deliberate lowering, the controlled descent of a woman whose body had been running on adrenaline and fury for 24 hours and had finally been given permission to stop. She set the crutch across her knees, rested her hands on top of it, looked at the space where the sedan had been. Sadie sat down next to her. Owen climbed into Lena's lap. The three of them sat on a curb in front of a building that had nearly destroyed their lives. And they didn't speak, and they didn't move, and the cameras kept rolling, but the story had shifted. It wasn't about Hargrove anymore. It was about a woman and her children, sitting, breathing, being still in a world that had spent 18 months trying to make them disappear. Rhett stood across the street with the sentinels and watched. Deacon was beside him, smoking, his face unreadable. The other men stood in a loose cluster. Not a formation, not a line. Just men standing near other men in the way that happens after something large has passed through and the shape of the world hasn't settled yet. "Deacon," Rhett said. "Yeah." "You okay?" Deacon smoked, watched the empty space where the sedan had been. The ember of his cigarette brightened and faded, a small orange heartbeat in the dark. "No," he said, "but I'm standing. That counts for something." Rhett didn't push. There would be time later, days, weeks, the long unspooling aftermath, for Deacon to reckon with what Hargrove's betrayal meant, the letter that had saved his career, the debt he'd carried for years, the mentor who had turned out to be the kind of man who poisons land and pushes women downstairs and calls it business. That reckoning would come, and it would be ugly, and it would happen in the private hours between 2 and 4 in the morning when men like Deacon sit alone with the architecture of their lives and discover that a load-bearing wall was rotten all along. But not tonight. Tonight, Deacon stood on a sidewalk in the town he'd made his home and watched the machines of justice begin to grind, and that was enough. The next 3 hours were logistics. Statements to the FBI agents who arrived in a second wave. Interviews with Kessler's podcast crew. Lena first, then Mrs. Barrera, then Marcus and Diane Caldwell, then a procession of families who had lost their homes to Graydon Hale's operation, and were now, for the first time, telling their stories to someone who was actually recording them. The Patels. The Nguyens. A single father named Ellis who'd been evicted from a house his grandfather had built, and who spoke into the microphone with a voice so steady and so broken that the producer had to step away and wipe her eyes. The Sentinels stayed. Not because they were needed. The FBI had jurisdiction, the media had the story, the crowd was calm and purposeful and needed no protection. They stayed because leaving felt wrong, because the families kept looking at them the way people look at a wall they're leaning against. Not with gratitude, exactly, but with the bone-deep acknowledgement that without the wall, they would have fallen. At midnight, the crowd began to thin. Families drove home. The podcast crew packed their equipment. The FBI wrapped their initial interviews and left with boxes of documents and the hard drives Cross had provided, evidence that would fuel an investigation lasting months. The sidewalk in front of the Graydon Hale offices emptied out, and the building went dark, and the street returned to the ordinary quiet of a Midwest town at midnight, as if nothing had happened, as if the ground hadn't shifted. Rhett rode back to Mill Street. The ride was 10 minutes. The streets were empty. His headlights swept across closed storefronts and dark intersections, and the occasional stray cat that froze in the beam and then vanished. The rain from last night had left puddles that reflected the streetlights in broken patterns, and the air smelled like wet asphalt and cut grass, and the faint, fading charge of a storm that had passed. Mill Street was quiet. The 6 houses still glowed. Mrs. Barrera's porch light. The Patel's kitchen window. The Caldwell's living room where Marcus was probably sitting in his chair with a beer, not sleeping, just being present in a house he'd almost lost. Rhett parked in front of the Quinn house. Killed the engine. Sat on his bike in the silence and let the night settle around him like water filling a space. The front door opened. Sadie stood in the doorway in pajamas, the kind with small printed horses on them, faded from washing, too short in the sleeves. She was holding something. In the porch light, he could see it was the photograph. The group photo from Helmand. 8 Marines in front of a vehicle in a place that felt like another planet from this street, this town, this moment. She walked to the edge of the porch, sat down on the top step, set the photograph on her knee. Rhett got off his bike, walked to the porch, sat down beside her. Not close. A respectful distance. The distance between a man and a child who are still learning the geography of trust. "You should be asleep," he said. "I know. Your mom's going to be mad. She's asleep on the couch. She hasn't slept in 3 days." They sat in the quiet. Down the street, a dog. The same dog that had barked 2 nights ago, or a different dog, it didn't matter. Let out a single soft bark and then went silent. "Did the bad man go away?" Sadie asked. "Yeah, he went away." "Is he coming back?" Rhett looked at the street, the empty houses, the houses with lights, the houses that were still standing because an 8-year-old girl had drawn a map on notebook paper and walked through a crowd of strangers and chosen one. "No," he said. "He's not coming back." Sadie turned the photograph over in her hands, ran her finger across the faces, stopped on the man in the center, her father, squinting, smiling, alive. "Mom told me about you," she said. "After you left for the meeting, she said you were with my dad when he died. She said you tried to get to him. I wasn't fast enough. She said you would say that." Sadie looked at him with those creek-water eyes, her father's eyes, and in the porch light they were green and gold and held something that no child's eyes should hold, but that this child's eyes held anyway. "She also said that my dad would have wanted you to stop saying it." Rhett's throat closed. He looked away, looked at the sky. The stars were out. The hard, bright stars of a Midwest summer that you only see away from city lights, the kind that make you feel simultaneously enormous and invisible. Your dad was the bravest man I ever knew, he said. His voice was rough, not broken, abraded, like wood that's been sanded by wind. I know. She said it simply, without drama, the way a child states a fact that is as real to her as the ground under her feet, even though the man it describes is someone she'll never remember holding her. She handed him the photograph. You keep it. I have the map. He took it, held it. 8 faces in a desert that didn't exist anymore, in a war that was supposed to be over, in a moment that had shaped everything that came after. He put it in the inside pocket of his cut, against his chest, where the weight of it felt like exactly what it was. A responsibility he'd been carrying for 6 years that had finally found its proper shape. Sadie stood up, brushed off her pajamas, walked to the door, stopped. Rhett? Yeah. Are you going to come back? Not because of the bad men, just, are you going to come back? He looked at her. This girl who had survived things that would break most adults, who had watched her neighborhood empty and her mother get hurt and her home get threatened, and had responded not by hiding but by drawing a map and walking into a crowd of strangers and finding the one person she believed could help. The courage in that act, the sheer, unreasonable, magnificent courage of it, was something Rhett would carry for the rest of his life, alongside the photograph and the guilt and the memory of a man on a radio in Helmand Province. Yeah, he said. I'm going to come back. She nodded, went inside. The screen door closed behind her. Through the window, he watched her check on Owen, who was asleep on the couch next to Lena, both of them curled together under the quilt, and then climbed the stairs to her room, her small feet making almost no sound on the wooden steps. Rhett sat on the porch until the sky began to change. Not sunrise. The pre-dawn shift, when the darkness goes from black to the deep blue of a bruise, and the first birds begin to test the silence with single, tentative notes. His coffee was long cold. His muscles ached from 2 days of tension and no sleep. His scar throbbed in the damp air, the way it always did when his body was tired enough to stop pretending it wasn't damaged. Deacon found him there at 5 a.m, rode up on his bike, killed the engine, sat on the curb across from the porch with a thermos of coffee he'd gotten from somewhere. Probably Mrs. Barrera, who seemed to have an inexhaustible supply and an unerring instinct for when men needed it. They drank coffee in silence. The street lightened around them. A car passed on Mill, someone going to an early shift, living the kind of ordinary life that exists alongside extraordinary events without knowing it. I called Hargrove's wife, Deacon said. Rhett looked at him. She didn't know. About Graydon Hale, about Southgate, about any of it. She thought he was doing consulting work for a real estate firm, standard stuff. He stopped, drank. She asked me if I thought he was a good man. A woman married to the guy for 30 years, and she's asking me. What did you say? I said I used to think so. I said I don't know anymore. I said the people who make the worst messes are usually the people who are best at looking clean. He poured more coffee. I'm going to have to testify. The FBI wants my statement about the letter, the relationship, the favors. All of it. Every part of my history with Hargrove is going to be on a federal record. Does that bother you? It terrifies me. Not because of what they'll find, but there's nothing criminal. But because the letter was real. The help was real. He saved my career and my benefits and probably my life. And he did it for reasons that turned out to be rotten. But the act itself, the kindness, if you can call it that, was the thing that kept me upright for 15 years. He set the thermos down. How do you keep standing on a foundation when you find out it's built on poison? You build a new one. Deacon looked at him. A long, searching look, the kind that strips away everything performative and goes straight to the wiring. Then he nodded. Not agreement, acknowledgement, the recognition that the answer was too simple and too true, and that simplicity and truth were not the same thing as easy. I owe Colt an apology, Deacon said. For what? For 3 years of being right for the wrong reasons. I removed Cross because of what he did, and I was right about that. But Colt was right about what we owe the people we cut loose. Cross fell into Hargrove's hands because we dropped him and nobody caught him. That's not an excuse for what he became, but it's a fact. and facts don't go away because they're inconvenient. You gonna tell Colt that? I'm gonna buy him breakfast and let him yell at me for an hour, and then I'm gonna tell him that. He almost smiled. Almost. The ghost of something that might become a smile if given enough time and enough coffee and enough mornings like this one, where the air was cool and the street was standing and the world hadn't ended overnight. The weeks that followed were not a fairy tale. Rhett wanted that understood because the families of Southgate deserved better than a neat ending. Federal investigations are slow. RICO cases take months to build. The EPA's environmental assessment of the contaminated land under Southgate would stretch into the following year. Graydon Hale's legal team fought every motion, challenged every filing, contested every piece of evidence with the relentless, well-funded persistence of an organization that had been built to withstand exactly this kind of scrutiny. But the story held. The podcast episode aired 4 days after Hargrove's detention and was downloaded 2 million times in the first week. Kessler's reporting triggered coverage from 3 national outlets. The state attorney general's office, the same office that had sat on Lena's complaint for 4 months, opened a formal investigation within 10 days. The city planning commissioner, who had approved the falsified environmental assessments, resigned. The county prosecutor, who had declined to pursue Lena's assault report, found himself the subject of an ethics review. The demolition order was never signed. Without Hargrove's authorization, and with federal agents crawling through Graydon Hale's records, the company's board suspended all operations in Southgate indefinitely. The zoning was frozen. The permits were revoked. The houses stayed. Lena Quinn became something she'd never intended to be, a public figure. Not a politician, not an activist in the professional sense, but something simpler and harder. A woman who told the truth and kept telling it until the truth became impossible to ignore. She testified before a state legislative committee. She gave interviews. She started a tenants' rights organization that operated out of her kitchen, the same kitchen where Rhett had made instant coffee on the day he'd arrived, with a budget of nothing and a volunteer staff of every family that had ever lived on Mill Street. Her wrist healed. The sling came off. The bruise on her jaw faded from yellow to nothing, but she walked with a slight limp from the cracked ribs that hadn't set perfectly. And Rhett noticed that she still flinched when she approached staircases, a small, involuntary tightening of her shoulders, as if her body remembered what her mind was trying to forget. Mrs. Barrera planted tomatoes. That detail seemed too small to mention, but it wasn't. She planted tomatoes in her front yard, 8 plants in a row along the fence, with cages made from wire hangers that Marcus Caldwell had bent into shape in his garage. She watered them every morning at 6, standing on her porch in her bathrobe with a hose that leaked at the connection, and by late summer the plants were tall enough to see from the end of the block. Red tomatoes ripening in the sun on a street that was supposed to have been bulldozed. The sight of them made Rhett's chest ache in a way he couldn't explain, and didn't try to. The Iron Sentinels came back to Mill Street every Saturday, not as guards. There was nothing to guard against anymore. They came because Burke had started helping Marcus rebuild the porch on the condemned house next to the Caldwells. And Harlan had discovered that he was good with children and spent Saturday afternoons teaching Owen to ride a bicycle in the empty lot at the end of the block. And Pike, sardonic, quiet Pike, had started dating Diane Caldwell's niece, a paramedic from Springfield who thought his sense of humor was charming and his motorcycle was ridiculous. Colt brought his tools. Every Saturday, he showed up with a truck full of lumber and hardware and the methodical patience of a man who understood that building things was the opposite of breaking them. He rebuilt the Patels' back steps. He replaced Mrs. Barrera's kitchen window. He fixed the sagging gate on the Quinn house and rehung the front door so it closed properly for the first time in 2 years. He worked with his one real hand and his prosthetic stabilizer, and he never mentioned Nathan Cross, and Deacon never mentioned the apology, and the debt between them settled into the quiet, understood currency of men who have said what needed saying and moved on. Cross himself disappeared. The FBI had his testimony, the recording Maceo had made, the documents, the hard drives, but Cross was gone. Witness protection, maybe, or just the vast, indifferent geography of a country big enough to swallow a man who wanted to be swallowed. Colt checked his phone for messages every few days. None came. Eventually, he stopped checking, and the absence of the gesture was its own kind of closure. Deacon testified. Twice. His testimony was clinical and devastating. The full history of his relationship with Hargrove, the letter, the favors, the calculated grooming of a vulnerable veteran by a man who collected debts the way other men collected weapons. When he walked out of the federal building in Springfield after the second session, he sat on his bike in the parking lot for 40 minutes without starting the engine. Rhett sat beside him on his own bike, equally silent, equally still. They didn't talk about it. They didn't need to. The conversation between men who have survived the same fire doesn't require words. It requires presence. 3 months after the night on the sidewalk, the neighborhood threw a block party, not a charity event, not an organized function. Just a Saturday in September when someone put a table in the street and someone else brought a cooler and someone else plugged a speaker into an extension cord and music drifted down Mill Street for the first time in years. The Patel's baby, 3 months older now, sat in a carrier on the grass and watched the world with the vast, uncomprehending attention of an infant who doesn't know that the world almost didn't include her street. The Caldwells danced. Actually danced. Marcus and Diane, in their 60s, moving to a song that was too young for them in a way that was too beautiful for anyone to point it out. The Sentinels were there, not in formation, not standing guard, scattered through the crowd like any other neighbors, which, Rhett realized, was what they had become. Burke was eating a hamburger with both hands and listening to Mr. Patel described the engineering problems of his home country's bridge infrastructure with the focused attention of a man who found all structural challenges fascinating. Maceo was showing Mrs. Barrera something on his phone, probably surveillance footage from the night she'd confronted the intruders, which she had asked to see 3 times and which made her laugh every time because she couldn't believe she'd actually done it. Sadie found Rhett near the edge of the party, leaning against his bike, watching. She was wearing new sneakers, actual new sneakers, not hand-me-downs, bought with money from the Tenants' Rights Organization's first successful grant application. She carried something flat and rectangular wrapped in brown paper. "This is for you," she said. He took it, unwrapped it. Inside was a frame, simple, wooden, the kind you buy at a hardware store. And inside the frame was the map, the original map, with its crayon streets and stick houses and the red X at the end of Mill Street. The crayon so heavy it had torn through the paper. But underneath the X, in careful new letters, not the shaky handwriting of a frightened girl, but the steady, deliberate hand of a child who had learned that her voice could change things, she had added 5 words. The place where people showed up. Rhett held the frame, looked at it, looked at Sadie, looked at the street behind her, the tables, the music, the people, the tomatoes growing along Mrs. Barrera's fence, the porch that Burke and Marcus had rebuilt, the gate that Colt had fixed, the houses that were still standing because a little girl had believed that a stranger might be worth trusting. "Thank you," he said. His voice was thick. "You're welcome." She paused, tilted her head. "Are you going to cry?" "No." "It's okay if you do. Mom cries sometimes. She says it's because the good things hurt as much as the bad things, just in a different place." Rhett looked at this girl, 8 years old, creek-water eyes, her father's eyes, wearing new sneakers on a street that had been scheduled for demolition, and he understood something he hadn't understood in 6 years of carrying a dead man's weight. You don't pay debts to the dead. You can't. The dead don't have accounts. What you can do, the only thing you can do, is take the love that the debt was made of and put it somewhere it can grow. A porch rebuilt, a window fixed, a street that stays, a child who knows she was worth showing up for. "Your dad would be proud of you," he said. Sadie smiled, not the careful, measured smile of a child who has learned to ration her emotions. A real smile, full, the kind that uses the whole face and doesn't hold anything back. "I know," she said, and walked back to the party. Rhett hung the framed map on the wall of his apartment that night, a small, sparse place above a laundromat on the east side of Carlo that he'd lived in for 4 years without putting anything on the walls. The map hung above his desk, next to the photograph Sadie had given him, and the 2 artifacts, the map and the photo, sat side by side like before and after images of the same story, the same debt, the same love that had taken 6 years and a child's courage to find its way home. He sat at the desk, looked at the red X, looked at the 5 words beneath it, the place where people showed up. Outside, the sound of a motorcycle, not his, someone else's, distant, fading, rolled through the night and disappeared. The laundromat hummed below him. The coffee in his mug went cold. The apartment was quiet and small, and it was enough. Down on Mill Street, in the last house on the block, Sadie Quinn turned off her bedroom light and lay in the dark listening to the sounds of a neighborhood that was still alive. A dog barking, a car door closing, her mother's footsteps in the kitchen, the low murmur of a television from the Barrera house next door. She pulled the quilt up to her chin, closed her eyes, and for the first time in months she fell asleep without checking the locks, without listening for engines, without the map under her pillow. She didn't need it anymore. The red X had done its job. It had brought them home.